Thank you very much, Chairman, for the opportunity to meet your committee this afternoon. I act as Chair of St Vincent's Healthcare Group and was a founding Director of St Vincent's Holdings, and I'm joined today, as you eloquently outlined, by Dr John Holian, Ms Imelda Reynolds, Professor Janice Walsh and Donal O'Rahilla. Everyone at St Vincent's Healthcare Group believes that Ireland is on the verge of an historic decision about the future of women's healthcare. It is historic in the terms of infrastructure development, with all the positive and badly needed new facilities that will be delivered with it. The relocation of the National Maternity Hospital to the Ellen Park Healthcare Campus is a key part of the Government's maternity strategy. We are proud to be a partner and play our part in what will be, when operational, a complete transformation of maternity and neonatal care, not only in Dublin, but also as a national care centre. From our perspective, the transformation of maternity care services, of which the proposed transfer of NMH to our Ellen Park campus is one part, coincides with and is in part facilitated by the complete transformation of St Vincent's Healthcare Group after over 175 years of ownership by the Religious Sisters of Charity. The April 2022 transfer of the RSC's Svhg shareholding to SV Holdings, our new shareholder, was the last formal step in reaching the board's objective of becoming a truly secular organisation free of any religious influence. The board were determined to achieve this objective, and we have done so. St Vincent's Holdings is the new owner of Svhg and is a registered Irish charity, a not-for-profit company governed by Irish law. It is not a public juridic body, and there is no vehicle in the registered constitutions of either company by which any religious authority or control can be exerted. This is a fact. It is also a fact that when the RSC transferred their shares to SV Holdings without any conditions requiring the practice of any Catholic ethics or any other religious ethos. Svhg is also a registered Irish charity, a not-for-profit company governed by Irish law. Our purpose and vision is to be a valuable part of the Irish healthcare system that achieves best outcomes for our patients and their families, to be known for the highest standards of patient care, clinical excellence, medical research and staff education, and to remain a voluntary independent group that invests all of our funds in the treatment and care of our patients. As a not-for-profit company with charitable status, all of our funds are reinvested in the treatment and care of our patients. St Vincent's Healthcare Group is a secular organisation. The hospital has no religious ethos. Services have been and will continue to be delivered in accordance with best international medical practice, compliant with the laws of Ireland and the people of all faiths and none. There are multiple protections in place to ensure no religious authority or control can be exerted. Our founding values are dignity, compassion, justice, quality and advocacy, values found in many institutions across the world and which cannot be interpreted as any attempt to directly or indirectly impose a Catholic ethos. In previous committee hearings last week, there has been many references to our culture. Culture in our hospitals, all three of them, is driven by a single focus: to provide the best possible care for all our patients. We were approached by the government to become a partner with them and the National Maternity Hospital, Holles Street, in the relocation of maternity services to the Ellen Park campus. The opportunity to assist in the provision of world-class maternity and neonatal health care, together with our long-standing working relationship with Holles Street, informed our decision to support and partner on this 21st century project. The new NMH facility will be located in the centre of our campus and will be physically integrated with our university hospital to ensure the best and seamless care for high-risk and pregnant women. The seamless care to NMH patients will be provided by ready access to over 250 consultants covering over 50 healthcare specialists. The lands at the Ellen Park campus have been owned outright by the St Vincent's Healthcare Group for 20 years. Two landowners and thus two separate independent hospitals would make it very difficult, if not impossible, to manage the Ellen Park campus and would also present significant risks to patient care. The Mulvey Agreement noted this important principle in the mediation agreement between all three parties. The important decision about to be made about the building of the National Maternity Hospital on the Ellen Park campus is, of course, properly a political decision, but involves the essential cooperation and agreement of the two voluntary hospitals involved. We hope our presence here today will assist you as legislators. St Vincent's Healthcare Group has embarked on a new course. It is lay, it is secular, it is a healthcare organisation which hopefully soon will welcome the National Maternity Hospital to our Ellen Park campus. It is a place that culturally and ethically fully upholds the values and the laws of our Republic. Thank you.
Thanks very much. So I'm going to kick it off with Senator Sean Conn.
Thank you, Chairman, and I'd like to thank Mr Minton for his opening statement and welcome all the witnesses here this afternoon. I do acknowledge a very unambiguous clarity in relation to the issue of church involvement. I think it's quite clear from your statement that you believe that there is, and you state quite clearly that there is absolutely no religious involvement in the running of St Vincent's now, or it hasn't been for some time. Just on that, and you say in your statement that after 175 years of ownership by the religious sisters, they announced they were ceasing in 2017. Was this cessation by the religious sisters in anticipation or as part of the relocation of the National Maternity Hospital? Was it part of that, or was it something that was in the ether for some time?
It was in the ether for over 7.5 years when myself and other colleagues engaged with the leadership team of the Religious Sisters of Charity to reach a mutually strategic outcome whereby they ceased their involvement in Irish healthcare and we became a secular organisation, which was the board's objective. That journey has taken 7.5 years, and the final steps were concluded in April of 2022. It's very important from the point of view of St Vincent's Healthcare Group that, having regard to social and other change in modern Ireland in the 21st century, that we become a secular organisation. It's good for our organisation, and much more particularly, it's good for our patients and their families.
Just as a matter of clarity, when would have been the last time there was direct involvement by the sisters in terms of the operations?
Well, that goes back a long time, so long I can't actually give you a particular year. The only contact, for want of a way of describing it in those terms, was that under the old constitutions, our former shareholders had the right to appoint 2 representatives to the board. And in 2017, they decided, when they announced that they were leaving healthcare in a slightly more formal way, those 2 representatives withdrew from the board. Since then, certainly over the last 4 years, in anticipation of the conclusion of the transfer of the shares, the board and our management teams have been working on the new constitutions of St Vincent's Healthcare Group, free of any Catholic ethos or ethical guides from the Sisters of Charity. So while the final step was concluded in April, just literally a few weeks ago, the direction of travel was very clear for the last number of years.
Okay, thank you. When was the last time the Department of Health, on behalf of government, would have approached you in terms of the purchase of the land? When was it finally accepted that that wasn't going to happen, or when would you have a date?
Well, I think how to respond to that point is that in 2017, we had correspondence with the then Secretary General of the Department of Health, which followed a lot of engagement with the department and its officials, where we outlined 4 key principles which informed our decision-making in terms of our participation as a partner in this project. So the board's decision-making framework from the very beginning, quite apart from 2017, it goes back probably 10 years, was 4 things. One is that there could be no impediment to the efficient and effective delivery of patient care, and that in no way would the delivery of patient care on our campus be adversely affected. Secondly, that our ability to develop our campus into the future would not be in any way impeded by the relocation of the maternity hospital to the Ellen Park campus. That while we were contributing other forms of consideration, we would not be expected to contribute any financial contribution to the project cost. And fourthly, we wanted an overarching system of clinical and clinical governance on the campus to make sure it was run to best international medical standards. So from that, we had a partnership from the beginning. We engaged in the Mulvey mediation agreement that gave rise to the Mulvey agreement. And I suppose from our perspective, what we brought to this particular arrangement was a substantial site, access to an integrated care system by virtue of the fact that the proposed hospital will be integrated with our university hospital, access to provide patients with not only the excellent medical care that our partners in NMH will bring when they relocate to the campus, but access to over 250 of our consultant cohort and 50 specialties. And all of that combines to make sure that patient care for women in Ireland comes into the 21st century on a seamless basis. I think also it was very important, for obvious reasons, I would say, that don't need to be stated, that we evolved into a secular organisation, free of any church influence or religious ethics. In the same way, ironically, that when Holles Street moved from their current constitutional framework to that of the NMH at Ellen Park DAC, that they also will leave behind any association with church influence in the form of the Catholic Archbishop of Dublin being the chairman, or entitled to be the chairman of Holles Street, and also there's other Catholic representation, former Catholic representation, etc.
Thank you for that. I suppose the two issues that I've outlined are two of the main sticking points, obviously, in this whole debate. And as public representatives, we receive correspondence, and obviously there will be a lot of media focus on these two particular issues. Is there anything additional that you think you can provide in terms of reassurance that will satisfy the concerns that people have about ownership and about religious ethos?
Okay. Well, maybe I'll start that answer, and Imelda and indeed Donald might want to comment. And indeed all of us might want to comment. But in the first instance, the legal arrangements for the transfer of the shares was into St Vincent's Holdings CLG, which is a not-for-profit registered charity under the laws of this country. And its constitution is an Irish company under the laws of this country. We were absolutely determined that there would be no restrictions placed in the constitution of that company, or indeed in its now subsidiary or proposed subsidiary, St Vincent's Healthcare Group, that would have any influence of Catholic ethics, the imposition of religious influence or Catholic ethics. Anybody who would have read those constitutions can clearly see that goal has been accomplished. We also ensured that specific parties bound under confidentiality agreements had access to our share purchase agreement and the other related legal document, indemnity, which again contains no conditions of what I've just described. Under our agreements, the HSE and other stakeholders have had access to those documents and have been reviewed by their lawyers before they gave consent to the transfer. And I don't know, Donald, whether you'd like to comment as our advisor.
Absolutely, just to comment to that. So the share is transferred to SVG Holdings without any conditions. So there's no imposition, legal imposition or otherwise, in relation to the ethos of the holding company. That's as clearly as I can state it, I think.
Okay, anyone else?
No, just to confirm that is the case. There are no conditions attached. There's no, there's no hidden agenda. There's nothing there behind the documents that everyone has seen. There were no conditions attaching to the shares transferring, and so I can give that complete assurance. When I joined the board in 2019, obviously it was post the Mulvey agreement, but it was very important for me personally that the direction and the strategy for the group was to deliver on the Mulvey agreement and to achieve the shareholding and to develop a secular hospital on the campus, secular medical healthcare facilities.
Okay. The term of clinically appropriate has again been raised by many, and there has been discussions regarding codicil or an addendum. Have you had any involvement or any sight or any discussions on that over the last fortnight since the Cabinet originally postponed the decision?
No, we've observed all the commentary and the concerns expressed about the clinical governance phrase in the various legal documents concerning the establishment of the new maternity hospital in Enham Park. That phrase obviously doesn't feature in any of our documents to do with the new holding company or indeed the constitution of St Vincent's Healthcare Group. It's an NMH issue. Having said that, you know, and as everybody is aware, the Minister has accepted that there are concerns about that phrase and is committed to reflecting on those. Originally, that phrase was requested by the HSE and was considered by the boards of NMH and ourselves and by our legal advisors, and we agreed to the insertion of the term into the various legal agreements. And Donal, I'd like to know whether you want to comment further on the legal aspects of the phrase.
Yeah, no, just on the legal aspects, and there has been quite a lot of commentary in relation to this. As Mr Menton has indicated, the Minister has indicated that he has listened to concerns in relation to it. From our perspective, we don't have it hasn't been inserted at the behest of SVHG. It was inserted by the Minister with a view to clarifying the protection of the NMH hospital, that the clinically appropriate, as the Minister has enunciated it, will relate to the type of procedures you would find in a maternity hospital, as opposed to a broad range of procedures that you'd find in other types of hospitals. So, and that, I personally, I think from a common sense approach, that's how it reads. But there is a concern has been raised, and the SVHG just awaits any further comment from one of our partners, be it NMH or the Minister, in relation to it.
The May Centre, it might be useful to hear from Janice Walsh, who's a clinician, given the alignment of that phrase and on the ground in Facebook.
Can we maybe bring Janice in on some of the other questions?
Okay.
You know, that's how the slot this time. So we David Cullinan next, but there will be plenty of time, Janice, for you to come in.
Thank you. We've heard a lot of clinical opinion on this issue, Mr. Menton, so I just want to very quickly stick with this issue of clinically appropriate, and if I can just ask the question again, because I'm a slight bit confused. You say that there was no engagement between the Minister, the HSE and St Vincent's Healthcare Group in relation to either an addendum, possibly a removal or a definition of the term clinically appropriate in either the lease or the constitution. Is that what you're telling us?
No, what I'm saying is that I'm aware we've had discussions about the fact that the Minister has been reflecting on the concerns expressed, but no, there hasn't been a view from the Department or the HSE as to whether the phrase would be deleted or defined, or whether the status quo.
But you accept that those phrases are peppered across the constitution and the lease?
Oh, they are,
and
yes.
Yes.
We understand
and
that, absolutely.
And if there was to be any removal or any definition inserted, or indeed any addendum, it would require the consent of all parties,
it would,
including.
Yes, absolutely.
But this is going to Cabinet tomorrow. Yeah. So is it possible that that could be done before that goes to Cabinet tomorrow?
We believe so, yes. I mean, I think we've had due consideration to the legal impact, and maybe Janice could cover the clinical one presently. So
we dealt with the clinical part. This is now in the hands of the. This was something that you said was inserted by the Minister at the behest of the HSE for all the reasons they gave. And we don't need to go over those again.
Yes.
But we're talking now about the potential of either a definition, a removal, or an addendum to what are legal contracts.
Or it remains within.
Or it remains a letter of comfort.
And that's my understanding, Deputy. Yeah, that's my understanding.
But my point is, up to now, as you sit here today, you've had no communication from the Minister that there may be an ask on their behalf to you that you would accept either the removal, a definition, or an addendum.
Well, there's been various discussions around all of those options, but we haven't been asked formally or otherwise to state our position.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Can I come to the ownership issue of the land?
Yes.
Because you say in your opening statement, which is true, that St Vincent's Healthcare Group own the land. It's the freehold that the group owns, isn't that correct?
That's correct.
And you say in your opening statement, and I have no reason to dispute this at all, that the land was transferred to yourself, and also when you say that on April the 22nd, they transferred the RSC's Svhg shareholding to St Vincent's Holdings was the last formal step in reaching the board's objective of becoming a truly secular organisation. But you also say there was no preconditions in relation to any religious ethos set down in that transfer. And I'm accepting that that's the case, that's what you say it is, so we take that at face value. Was there any other preconditions?
None of a religious...
No, not non-religious.
Yeah. Well, clearly in the share purchase agreement and in the share indemnity agreement, there would have been the typical conditions, I would have called them at, in a share transaction of this nature.
And were any of those conditions shared with the Minister and the HSE?
They were.
They were.
The HSE had full copy of all the documentation within the context of the confidentiality provisions of the share purchase agreement.
Would they have had a copy of a sight of all of the correspondence from the religious order and St Vincent's Healthcare Group or St Vincent's Holdings in relation to the religious order removing themselves completely from?
Well, the only correspondence as such is the final share purchase agreement and the indemnity.
And there's no other correspondence?
No.
That's okay.
There was plenty of discussions, obviously, both with ourselves and the RSC and indeed with our...
So what I'm saying is, what you're trying to establish here, there was absolutely no preconditions of any nature, apart from the ones you've cited, which are quite technical, but there was no preconditions. So essentially, St Vincent's Healthcare Group are the sole owners of the land to do with the land what you please?
Yes.
Absolutely no preconditions.
Not as we please. We're bounded by the Constitution of St Vincent Healthcare Group and indeed the Constitution of St Vincent's Holdings.
But what I'm saying is that you could dispose of the land, you could make decisions around the land, you could, if you wanted to. It's in the gift of the board to make a decision, if they so wanted to gift the land to the state, if that's what they wanted to do. There's no legal reason as to why that can't be done.
Well,
there's no block from the Sisters of Charity. There's no
absolutely not. No, absolutely not. No block. No.
So what I'm trying, it's a very
sorry,
Mr. Mayor. It's a very, as you can understand, it's a very clear question because it's an issue that many people have raised.
Yes.
Because I'll go through it in a few moments. This arrangement that we've landed on, because you talk about the impossibility of managing what I would assume you're talking about is a HSE hospital on the grounds of Ellen Park, where you have a private hospital and a voluntary hospital. I'm not sure that really holds water when the National Children's Hospital and St James's are co-located. But whatever about the impossibility of that as you see it, and I don't agree, we have ended up with a very convoluted, complicated company structure, which I might talk you through in a second.
Okay.
But what I'm trying to establish is, if there is no preconditions imposed on St Vincent's Healthcare Group in relation to what they do with the land, if you are the sole owners of the land, if there is no legal impediment to the board making a decision, then there are obviously other reasons why. But what I'm asking is it your right and the board's right and St Vincent's Healthcare Group's right to gift the land to the state if that's what you wanted to do?
Yes, because...
So you're correct in saying that, and it is correct to say that the St Vincent's Healthcare Group and SV Holdings can make a decision in relation to dispose of its land. There are a couple of factors in relation to that. One of the factors is it's a charity and it has to have regard to how it disposes of assets. The second factor is...
That doesn't prevent it from doing so.
It depends. A charity can't just give away property willy-nilly, for sure. So there is a consideration process in relation to the disposal of land, whether that's by lease or whether that's by freehold, in relation to the purpose that the land is going to be put to. Another consideration for the board is how it assures land, what impact that has on its own assets that it needs to run the hospitals for charitable purposes.
And isn't that part of the problem here, though, Mr. O'Reilly, because I'm looking at a report from the Controller and Auditor General. It was a 2010 report, I think it was.
I'm not familiar with that.
It was looking at 16 voluntary hospitals. This is their conclusions. Well, read it for you. 16 voluntary hospitals and a number of other health services providers are effectively integrated into the public healthcare system. However, these entities function as arm's-length bodies with their own legal status and with capacity to transact business in accordance with their own constitutional arrangements. Considerable public resources are provided to them for the provision of public health services and the construction and maintenance of related facilities as required. St Vincent's Healthcare Group has pledged publicly funded assets in return for bank finance for development of its private hospital. So essentially we have a leveraging of what is a public asset for what is a private hospital. That's what and it goes on to say the situation illustrates a hazard that attaches to the provision of services through fully subvented or nearly fully subvented private institutions. Their freedom to pursue their other objectives may be exercised in a way which does not protect the state's financial interest.
Absolutely.
I am aware, although I wasn't on the board at that point in time, that remedies were put in place, appropriate grant agreements between St Vincent's Healthcare Group and the HSE to protect the state's interests, both on a retrospective basis and indeed a prospective basis in terms of the new facility that was financed.
But Mr. Menton, what Mr. O'Reilly was saying a few moments ago, one of the reasons why, or one of the impediments which is now being put up, which is the first time I've heard this, because up to now we've been told by St Vincent's Healthcare Group, the reason why there is a reluctance on your part to transfer the land to the state is because of the need for the integrated campus.
Yes.
That's
Absolutely.
the reason we've been given.
Absolutely.
It wasn't about assets, it wasn't about any of those issues. So it wasn't me that introduced that with respect to Mr. O'Reilly. What I'm saying is there was a CNAG report back in 2010 which cited concerns. Do we want to be here in 5 years' time and 10 years' time with a CNAG report which raises more concerns? The answer is no.
Well, I don't believe the framework that's on the table for discussion would in any way expose the state. Quite the contrary, in my humble opinion.
Well, I'll just make one final observation if I can, because and I want to thank the group for coming in, and I said I would do this. So this new company, National Maternity Hospital, DAC, is being established, which will have directors, we're being told, from 3 different sources. So 3 from the existing maternity hospital, 3 from St Vincent's, and 3 public interest directors. That is a subsidiary of St Vincent's Healthcare Group, which effectively would be the landlord. They will own the land and they will lease the land to the state. So the lease arrangement is with the HSE, isn't that correct?
That's correct.
That's correct.
The landlord would be St Vincent's Healthcare Group.
That's what I just said. St Vincent's Healthcare Group will be the landlord and will lease the land to the HSE.
Yes.
And then there's a licence agreement in place as well, is that correct?
There is, yeah, for the use of the building.
And St Vincent's Healthcare Group, which is the landlord, is a subsidiary of St Vincent's Holdings.
Correct.
And St Vincent's Holdings has its own board,
It does.
own directors,
Yes.
own constitution,
Yes.
as does St Vincent's Healthcare Group,
Correct.
as does this new hospital.
Correct.
So when you talk about an impossible situation in terms of having a public hospital with another public hospital and a private hospital on the same campus, and you say it's difficult and impossible, it's hard really to relate that when you look at the very convoluted, complex structure that we're being asked to approve with respect. Sorry?
I'm going to try to be fair to everyone. We may have a second round, so David has indicated that he won't be here for the second round. So,
well, I've made my point and I thank the witness.
Do you want to reply?
Yes, I think it's important. I mean, I think that at the end of the day, this project is all about improving healthcare for women. It's a partnership approach. We agreed to enter into that partner approach against the 4 principles that I outlined to Senator Kine. The lease ownership of the land, which is the proposition to the government, is to ensure that there is a protection of the state's finances and the construction of the building, no more, no less. We were originally asked to grant a lease of 99 years. That was increased to 150.
I won't be back. Just ask one quick question.
Go on, ask a question.
Yeah, one final question is, and just on that point, because the lease has changed from 99 years to, we were told, it was muted possibly 150 years to 299 years.
Yes.
Has the Taoiseach ever corresponded with the St Vincent's Healthcare Group on the issue of the ownership of the land at any point?
The Department of Health
The Taoiseach, I asked.
No, not to my recollection.
Okay.
Not to my recollection.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. We'll move on to John Laird. Thank you.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks to our witnesses. Just a couple of really brief questions initially that I hope require brief answers. Some of them I think you've answered. The Religious Sisters of Charity, did they insert or attach any religious ethos conditions into the transfer of shares when departing?
No.
Did the Vatican try to impose any conditions on St Vincent Hospital Group or St Vincent Hospital before the share transfer?
No.
For the clinicians, have you ever been told to refuse a patient medical treatment on religious grounds?
Never. I mean, from my point of view,
Never is fine. Okay. Just to a couple of questions. The nuns announced that they were gifting the land, and then they didn't gift the land. Could you give us a brief explanation as to what happened there?
Well, there was a press release, as you quite rightly point out, which had a headline that was unfortunate, is the nicest way I could put it. When you read the detail of the press release, they did exactly what the press release said. They transferred the shares in St Vincent's Healthcare Group to St Vincent's Holdings. And, you know, I can't really be held accountable for the drafting of by public relations firms of you know, titles on press releases. But they did exactly as they intended to do.
Okay. So people will be watching, you know, because it's created, there's a lot of complexities around it,
Yeah.
and the different companies,
Yeah.
structures that have been set up. So watching the debate, listening to the debate, it seems to me you have St Vincent's Hospital owns the land, the National Maternity Hospital is going to create a new hospital on site.
Yes.
That hospital is going to overlap on existing St Vincent's Hospital architecture.
Yes.
Yeah. So it does make a lot of sense. You have a background in business and commercial law, or not commercial law, but property transactions.
Yeah.
It makes sense to establish actually an entity to govern, at the very least, the overlapping pieces. Okay. Just in relation to, because the integrity of the campus was an issue going back, you've talked about that, I think I've covered it. Now in 2017, this is just a political point, St Vincent's Hospital Group at that point wasn't countenancing any sale or lease of part of the land or any separate ownership of a hospital on site. So I think that goes to what the present Minister Donnelly has achieved. The HSE actually owns the hospital and the land is being leased at €10 a year for a total of 299 years, which the arguments of many essentially involves ownership. Just in relation to why can't you gift the land? There was an article recently in The Currency which covers a lot of this, you might be familiar with. So St Vincent's Hospital, as Deputy Cullinan adverted to, offered its land as collateral when it borrowed to redevelop the private hospital in 2010. That came to the attention of the Controller and Auditor General. So it seems from the article written by Tom Hubert in The Currency that if St Vincent's Hospital Group gave the land under the new maternity hospital to the state, it would find itself in default of its loans and might become insolvent. Is that correct?
No.
Okay.
I think the point I'd like to clarify is that the real reason, the only reason that we are offering a lease ownership of this land upon which the state will finance the construction of and own effectively for 299 years at an annual rent of €10 per annum, is that offers protections to both ourselves and Holles Street in what that building will be used for. And that's clearly set out in the lease. The protections afforded under a lease ownership arrangement as opposed to a freehold ownership arrangement are radically different. Because we have no protections then as to what, or indeed Holles Street would have, in the absence of the current arrangements, to what that hospital is used for. And the whole purpose of this relocation is that that building will house vastly improved maternity care, integrated into a university hospital with access to a lot of specialties and other consultants. That's the whole point, from our perspective, of this partnership.
So we've dealt with the the Vatican papers, one of the previous witnesses spoke about the model of the Bon Secours group, that it was purchased by an international healthcare group.
Yeah.
Is that possible here? Is it possible for an international healthcare group to view the entire St. Vincent's Hospital campus, including a new national maternity hospital, as one structural entity?
Yeah. Well, it's a very interesting question, and the answer is no, we cannot sell St. Vincent's Healthcare Group, and I'd like Donald to reaffirm that under our new constitution.
Absolutely. There is a number of protections, as you'll have seen in the lease. There's an obligation on St. Vincent Healthcare Group not to permit a change of ownership in its shares without the consent of the HSE. At the Svhg Holdings company that took the shares from the sisters, that can't transfer that share. That's regulated by the charities regulator, as is Svhg. So everything is kind of locked in. The Svhg shares in SV Holdings are locked into that company. Within Svhg, the movement of that share is double locked in relation to a HSE consent.
And there is, as a result of the 2010 Controller and Auditor General report, the HSE has first option on what exactly if there was a decision to sell?
They have a first option on the freehold of the site of the NMH hospital within the first, it's 20 to 30 years depending on when the hospital is actually finally built. But they would have first option. So if the Svhg were offering that portion, just the freehold of the NMH hospital, to a party to sell, it has to go through a process with the HSE to see if the HSE want to buy the freehold at that point.
What about so you couldn't sell the National Maternity Hospital. Can you sell any of the existing Vincent's Hospital campus?
Yeah, the answer to that is yes. Yeah, there's no. Yeah, sorry, can Svhg sell property? So the legal answer is yes. It's subject, obviously, to how it applies proceeds for charitable purposes and all that. But yes, yeah, it could. Yeah.
Could you use the National Maternity Hospital as leverage, mortgage leverage?
No, and I just want to be very clear on this, because I think there has been some commentary in it. Once the 299-year lease is granted to the HSE, what the freehold that Svhg holds in the property is obviously subject to that lease. So we say kind of a virtual freehold is held by HSE, or an ownership is held by HSE. So in relation to creating security over that interest, it's subject to the lease. So the lease is protected. It's not a security that takes value from what's on the site. It's a technical point for keeping the entire of the campus under one ownership.
So I was thinking then, what was in it for the Religious Sisters of Charity? Now, I may be wrong on this, but I can think of one other example in my constituency where the Sisters of Mercy, they didn't give the land away, but they sold it at below market value to a local sports club on the basis that it would never be developed residentially, and that they would have recourse, there would be recourse, just couldn't be done. So they have no interest in it, in the land. They've essentially vacated it. As another example of Carmelites, and again in part of my constituency. So there are examples where, I'm not going to say it's done philanthropically, but there is no, what you're saying is either in the holding company or in any of the papers, there's no fingerprints, footprints of the Religious Sisters of Charity. If events were to change in a century, there's no route back in to this company for the Religious Sisters of Charity or any church-related organisation.
This is covered in the Catherine Gray report. In the appendix to that report, which was an investigation of the role of voluntary hospitals in the state in public healthcare, there's clear documentation which illustrates the significant difference, for example, between the strategy pursued by the Mater and the Sisters of Mercy, and ourselves at Vincent's and the Sisters of Charity. If you go into that appendix, you will see very clearly, in relative terms, that when you get to the net surplus of the disposal of assets, however that may arise, the proceeds go through a cascading, but eventually go back to the Vatican, in very simple terms. No such construction has been put on the share purchase agreement or the other legal documentations in terms of the Sisters of Charity transferring their shares into the St. Vincent's Holding Group. I can't speak for the motivation of the Sisters of Charity other than they wanted to cease their involvement in Irish healthcare. We wanted to be a secular organisation to respond to the needs of our patients in modern Ireland, and there was a mutually inclusive objective there satisfied. We had our motivation, they had their motivation. We didn't question theirs, they didn't question ours, but I can tell you categorically that we would have never accepted as a board, a situation where there was some legacy 100 years from now or 150 years from now that involved any mitigation of the objective of becoming a secular organisation.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm going to move on to Roisin Chartles next.
Thanks very much. I'd like to welcome our witnesses today. And just at the outset, I think it's important just to note that there are multiple examples of shared campuses, you know, for different purposes, health services and other services, where there would be a management company that would deal with the interface issues. And in fact, in Texas, there's an example of multiple hospitals sharing the one campus, but they're all individual, independent hospitals. And, you know, I can't help thinking that when you look at all of the detail involved in this, while there's many concerns, that what this actually boils down to at the end of the day is an issue of land value. And I think there's no getting away from that. So I have a number of questions to ask you, Mr. Menton. In 2020, St. Vincent's Healthcare Group had total liabilities of €450 million, and of that, over €370 million was long-term debt. Isn't that the case?
I don't have the accounts in front of me, so I can't categorically confirm or deny what you've just asserted.
Okay, I have them here anyway, and it's provided there. That detail is provided.
Yes.
So long-term liabilities are €450 million.
The liabilities of deferred grants, I really...
They're liabilities in your financial report.
Yes, indeed.
Okay, and isn't it the case that that situation, your financial situation, had deteriorated by about 20 million on the previous year?
I unfortunately don't have the accounts in front of me, so I have a difficulty.
Surely you know whether the situation is improving or deteriorating.
What I can say, no.
Sorry, you can't confirm that figure?
Sorry, our financial position as a board...
Sorry, I've asked you a specific question just on that. The deteriorating financial position, 2020 on 2019, was by 20 million. Can you confirm that?
I can't confirm it because I don't have the numbers in front of me.
Okay, so another question I want to ask you then. Your annual deficit has been increasing every year since 2013, and by 2020 it had reached €59 million.
Yes.
Isn't that the case?
I'm happy to accept your figures, yeah.
Well, can you confirm them? Yeah.
Well, I'm waiting to confirmation of them, yeah.
So have you yet prepared the accounts for 2021?
They're in the process of completion, yes.
Okay, and what's your expectation in relation to those accounts? Do you expect a further deterioration in your liabilities?
Our shareholders' funds at the end of December 2020 were 200 million. 200 million, positive. Our financial statements for 2021 will be published presently over the next few months, and we are quite happy with the financial performance of all the hospitals.
My question is, do you expect a further deterioration in your financial, in your liabilities?
Sorry, do we have this one? Yeah, sorry, I beg your pardon.
It's an overall question.
Yes,
do you
indeed.
expect the situation to disimprove or improve in terms of liabilities? What's your expectation as chair
Our
of the board?
expectation is that, because I'm just Sorry, I'm concerned that I don't want to mislead you.
Okay,
because
I'm just asking you
Now,
your expectation about your
my expectation
liabilities.
is clearly that during the course of the pandemic in 2021, that our financial situation would not be as good.
Okay, you do expect the situation to deteriorate. Okay, so also
well, broadly similar actually to 2020.
Okay, you have a mortgage with Bank of Ireland on the private hospital of €117 million. That's correct, isn't it?
117 million, yes.
How much is owed on that mortgage now?
Approximately 100 million.
100 million
yes.
owed on that, okay.
Yes.
So, all of your debts are registered as charges on all of the properties on the Ellen Park campus, including the site of the new maternity hospital, isn't that correct?
The charges provided to the Bank of Ireland are a first fixed charge on the private hospital itself. There are floating charges on parts of the Ellen Park campus that have not been state financed. And there is a floating charge currently on the proposed site for the NMH facility, which will be where discussions have been held with the bank.
Okay, I just asked you if the registered charges are on all of the properties.
No, not all of the properties.
Okay.
On the Ellen Park campus.
So
no.
Can you provide a note on that? Maybe somebody in your
Absolutely,
team there will.
Yes.
And you're now granting a lease to the HSE on foot of this leasehold document that we have here.
Yes.
Is it not a term of this lease that you reserve the right to mortgage this new hospital building?
Yes.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
That's a term of the lease?
It's a power that's reserved for the landlord to create security, yeah.
Okay. So if you run into difficulties, you would be able to mortgage the new hospital building?
And can I just speak to this?
Sorry, isn't that the case?
Yeah. I need to fully answer this to give probably a proper reflection of what the answer is. What SVHG will be able to do is charge the freehold interest, which is subject to the lease. The lease is protected, so irrespective of what happens up there, the lease is protected.
Would be able to mortgage the building.
Yeah, I just wanted to make Deputy, sorry.
Okay, no, I just want
you
you to confirm that you could mortgage the building. So, assuming that you mortgage the hospital building, what do you...
Sorry, and I just want to emphasize...
I suppose... Sorry, just a moment. Assuming that you may have to mortgage the hospital building, what do you suppose will happen if you are unable to meet your debts in the future?
And I'm just going to, I'm not rephrasing the question. It's not the property, it's not the building that's been mortgaged, it's the freehold interest that SVHG has that is subject to the long lease to the HSE. Now, there is an important distinction there.
Okay.
So, but I'll answer your question. So, in the event that a mortgage was created over that site...
That's okay. I'm happy with what you've said. Okay.
No, but sorry, to answer your question, sorry, what would happen if there was an event of default or receiver was appointed over that security, I think is your question, isn't it? The lease stays intact. The HSE has an option in those circumstances to acquire the freehold as would have been outlined during the course of
Okay, so just going back to Mr. Menton then, your debt situation is pretty bad now. I'm sure you'd accept that. And it looks like it's going to get worse because you've had debt relief for the past 2 years as a result of COVID. And this debt relief is going to run out later this year. Isn't that the case?
That's an inaccurate characterisation.
Okay, so how long is that debt relief lasting?
Sorry, could I just give a broader picture and I'll come exactly back to your point.
I'm sorry now,
okay.
Look, I'm under pressure of time.
Well, then,
and I need you to answer the specifics.
Can I just explain that as in any typical loan, there are various conditions.
Sorry, I'm asking you about the debt relief as a result of COVID. Is that due to run out this year?
It will be, we are currently negotiating with the bank very successfully to have those waivers extended towards the end of 2023. And we are very, very confident, despite your observations, that those waivers on our covenants will be extended for another 18 months, de minimis. I'd also like to make the point that the Board of Directors, which is an experienced Board of Directors, have absolutely no concerns about the financial viability of our group. And we would reject wholeheartedly any assertion to the contrary.
Yeah, I just want a short answer, if you don't mind. So, in light of what you've confirmed there, so how can you guarantee to the taxpayers of this country that the banks will never repossess the new hospital building?
Because of the legal documentation associated with its creation.
Because of the lease, sorry, I didn't mean to cut across you.
No, you're okay.
So if I just tease through this, so if there was a mortgage on the freehold interest of the hospital, a receiver is appointed there. The long lease to HSE is under that. All that receiver can sell is the freehold interest subject to the lease. So thankfully in landlord tenant law, the leasehold is protected. So it's an interest in property that doesn't rely on what occurs at the freehold level. It's a separate interest that's recognised, and that interest would remain intact.
But if you run into difficulties again, you can mortgage the building of the new hospital. Isn't that the case?
We can, just to be clear, and I have said this a few times, Deputy. Yeah, so I'll say one more time if you could indulge me. What the SVHG can mortgage, should it choose to, is the freehold interest in the NMH site, which is subject to the lease to the HSE. The HSE is protected in law in the event of anything that occurs at the freehold level.
Okay. All I can do is read what's in the first schedule, which refers to the premises as any buildings erected or to be erected thereon.
Correct. Yep.
So
and,
my understanding of that is that it would include the hospital building.
Yeah, and I just want to be very clear about this. The interest that's demised is the land and the buildings that are built on it. All of the economic interest is down with the tenant. That's good marketable title, as you would have heard from several people during the course of last week. So the value of the freehold is €10 a year, provided that's the rent it receives. So that's the value of the freehold, unless the rent increases because for the charity law purpose. So that's what. So it's not fully accurate.
Okay.
How you're phrasing it, I think, Deputy. In fairness.
Okay, I'm just reading the schedule there. That's all I can go on. Can I ask you? You're saying you're a new company now.
Yeah.
Secular company, etc., etc. But I want to ask you, Mr. Menton, has the government asked you to gift or sell the site to them now that you're a new company and you claim you're unencumbered?
The company that owns the land is St Vincent's Healthcare Group that has been in existence for 20 years.
Yeah.
So it's not a new company.
You ask the question, let the man answer, and we're going to move on to Breed Smith then.
The landowner is a company that's been in existence for 20 years, St Vincent's Healthcare Group, which, for the avoidance of doubt, is a fully viable entity, and we would reject categorically any observation, insinuation or otherwise that it isn't. We have...
Sorry, just my question was, has the government asked you now, or St Vincent's Holdings, to sell the site?
No, not St Vincent's Holdings, because they don't own the land. We had discussions 5 or 6 years ago with Jim Breslin, the former Secretary-General of the Department of Health, as part of
They haven't asked you currently in
recent
weeks or months?
No. You stop badgering the question, the witness, please. You've asked the question, let the man answer, and we'll move on to Breed Smith then. Are you finished?
Other than to summarise that we reject categorically that the financial situation of St Vincent's Healthcare Group is in any way in doubt, categorically. Like any other business in the last 2 years, financially, our performance has suffered slightly, but as a board, we are absolutely categorically satisfied with the viability of St Vincent's Group now and into the future, in the near term. You can't see into the future too long.
Thank you for coming today, all of you. And you'll understand from our perspective, we have, in the opposition mainly, been asking for a discussion around this deal for 2 years now, and we're getting it in the last 2 weeks, and it's really unsatisfactory for us. And again, I'm going to appeal publicly here to the government to delay this and give us more time, because we are being pushed into a position of having to accept a lot of information, a lot of facts, without having the time to drill down into them. And we're also being hamstrung in the sort of asks we can make on you. But one of the things I'm interested in, and I don't want you or anyone else to take anything personal out of my line of questioning. You talked about the hospital evolving into a secular hospital. I'm interested in that path of evolution, okay? So I want to ask you a couple of questions around it. And one is that, like other Catholic organisations, the membership of the sisters would have been falling consistently over decades now. Was it not inevitable that they would be pulling back from direct involvement because there are too few of them? I believe in previous constitutions they allowed for the sisters or their nominees to make appointments and to carry out functions on the boards. So was it not inevitable, rather than just being about let's get the National Maternity Hospital done, that it was inevitable that they were going to fade away because of that evolutionary process?
Yes, I concur completely with your analysis. I think there are two aspects to what is under discussion here. Obviously, the NMH project is the main business of the day, but I think you raise a very interesting point. If we'd never been asked by the government or other stakeholders to partner on the NMH project, I'm having a scintilla of doubt in my mind that we would have a new holding company with the same constitutions, the same share purchase agreement with the share indemnity.
Okay.
Because your point is well made.
Yeah,
Demographically, they were withdrawing.
Demographically, they were withdrawing, and they knew that this was happening. Obviously, they're not stupid. History was taking its course that they weren't going to be around forever.
Yes,
not in sufficient numbers. So you started working in St Vincent's in 2014. Is that correct?
September 7th, 2014, I was made a director and I assumed the role of chairman.
At what point did you ever have the first discussion with the sisters about that evolution and the possibility of them leaving the group?
I would say in the subsequent 1 to 2 months.
Within 1 to 2 months?
Yes, it was a very important priority of the board. Okay,
so when you were recruited or appointed, did the sisters play any role in your recruitment or your appointment? Did they seek you out, or did they interview you? Did they appoint you?
I had been previously a member of the board. I had resigned from the board, and I was invited to return as a director. So, like in any
invited by
the sisters.
By the sisters. So the sisters wanted you back.
Yes.
In a situation where they knew that their demise was inevitable, they wanted you back into the position that you're in.
Yes.
Yeah, so there must be a good reason for that, and I don't doubt you're a good worker and a conscientious man, but there must be, from their perspective, a good reason. But just staying on the question of evolution, you talked about the hospital is now completely secular. Have you removed all the iconography? Is Mother Mary Aikenhead picture gone, or the crucifix is gone?
We have started that process. We've removed the iconography on the grounds of St Vincent's, of the Ellen Park campus. That is a task that the board will consider in the ensuing months, because obviously the final step in the transfer of ownership only took place in April. And there's some guidance in Catherine Day's report about iconography within what are hitherto religiously owned institutions such as ours, and we will take that guidance and we will ensure that we will display appropriate sensitivity to the needs of all our stakeholders.
Okay, so the evolutionary process isn't complete. It's still in course. We're still removing the church from our healthcare services in St Vincent's and removing the physical manifestations of it.
On evolution of church influence, I think the people best placed to give you some perspective on that, Deputy, are my two consultants.
Sorry, I wanted to ask you the questions, but my next question to you is, on the course of this evolution, as late as 2020, recruitment required a doctor or nurse who was recruited into the this is my understanding, recruited into the healthcare group to follow the Catholic ethos, to have ethical beliefs, to have ethical commitment to the project of St Vincent's under Mother
well long gone at that stage.
When was it then, please?
I would say over the last 10 years.
So going right back to 2012, well, it was not a requirement of recruitment.
Sorry, I wouldn't give a specific date, but this evolution has been going on, I would say, for the last 7 or 8 years. I could certainly testify to that.
Yeah, but I'm asking you, when was it no longer a requirement of the recruitment process for the Catholic ethos to be adhered to?
I would say over a similar time period.
Could you please get me an accurate answer on that?
Okay, I will.
Okay, so I'm interested in you quoting Catherine Day as being somebody whom you'd look up to look at this process of evolution and how this can be done, the separation of church and state. She also said, however, in her report of 2018, which was commissioned by the previous Minister for Health, Simon Harris, that co-location could be achieved through contractual terms that both hospitals agree to collaborate effectively and efficiently without detriment to patient care. And your statement says that you must retain ownership for the delivery of integrated patient care. This is an unsatisfactory answer to Catherine Day, obviously, and I think to most of us in the opposition in the Oireachtas.
Yes.
And you just need to clarify this for me. You say ownership is absolutely crucial to offer protection that the hospital would be used for what it's supposed to be used for, ownership of the land.
Together with our partner, NMH.
Together with your partner. So ownership of the land is crucial to ensure that the hospital will be used for what it is intended to use for, but then so is the term clinically appropriate. So you're doubling down on this need to be sure that a maternity hospital is going to be used for maternity hospital. What is your fear? Are you afraid if it went into the ownership of the HSE that they'd maybe someday open it up as a fun park? What is your fear that you have to double down on both of these controversial counts of ownership and clinical appropriateness?
Well, on the latter point, I'm not doubling down because it was a suggestion, a requirement by the HSE, not by Vincent's or
So you'd be willing for that to be dropped?
Well, I would be willing. I would certainly engage with our two partners as to whether it's continuing to be appropriate to be inserted in the various legal agreements.
Well, we had indications from the National Maternity Hospital witnesses who were here that they would be very willing for it to be dropped. So that's you. If you were willing and they were willing.
We haven't had a tripartite engagement. To be fair, we haven't had a tripartite engagement with the Department of Health, the Minister, NMH, and ourselves. So we would look forward to that, and I think that in a spirit of partnership we would get to the right solution, whatever that's deemed to be.
And would you agree then, in the spirit of partnership, that those of us who are elected to the Oireachtas to represent the people's interest in this country should be given more time to allow your tripartite discussion to look at dropping the question of clinical appropriateness, because there seems to be certain flexibility coming from yourselves and the National Maternity Hospital on it, and it doesn't seem to be required to ensure that a maternity hospital is a maternity hospital.
Well, as I say, I don't think it would involve a huge amount of engagement, frankly, as to what the desired outcome amongst the three partners would be. And may I also make reference to, I did raise the Catherine Day report in a different context, responding to a different question. The Catherine Day report has various recommendations in it, and when it was published, we had an opportunity to discuss its contents with the former Secretary-General, Jim Breslin. We welcomed the direction of travel, the various recommendations in that report, and we believe that we have very little issue in complying with the various recommendations. And one of the recommendations in that report concerns the state's investments in assets on voluntary hospitals, and it does express a desire that in the first instance it's more desirable for the state to own the land.
Okay, can I stop you there? This is my very last question. I've got 50 seconds left.
Let me finish and I'll let you.
No, just on the same thread, on that very same thread.
Yes.
Do you understand how it rankles with us and with the general population, particularly women, that anything less than full ownership looks like that it is not in control of the people of this country? In other words, that whatever happens in that hospital over the next 300 years, or even, whatever amount of time I live to be a TD that's elected, that you are not accountable to this House, fully accountable to this House for that hospital, because you are a hospital arrangement that has private healthcare, that has St Michael's, that has public healthcare, that has St Vincent's, so you're not fully accountable as a board to us.
Our accountabilities are to make sure that our patients have the best outcomes.
No doubt about that.
No, but
but if we have questions about that, if we have worries about that, where does it go to?
That's the motivation.
I didn't ask about the motivation.
For the construction of the fabric.
I know, it's just difficult, Sean, when you're not getting the answer to the question you've asked. I didn't ask about the motivation. I asked, do you understand why it would rankle with the people that it is not in full ownership of the people when it's being paid for by the people's taxes?
I beg your pardon. I acknowledge those concerns, but I think those concerns are mitigated in the present arrangements.
Well, if they were, we'd all be happy campers. We wouldn't be sitting here. Okay. They're certainly not mitigated for the representatives of the people.
Okay.
Okay. Erna Dorkin's next.
Thank you, Chairman. Welcome, our guests.
Hello.
And the first question is, obviously you're concerned and aware of the concern expressed by various other speakers here who claim to represent the general public in its entirety. I just want to remind myself and everybody else that we on this side of the table were also elected by the people, and we represent the general public and the taxpayer to the same extent, as would always be the case. So my question is this: are we satisfied, are you satisfied, that the arrangement in relation to ownership as versus the lease gives the necessary guarantees that the state would ordinarily expect in relation to a lease? So, lease versus ownership. Are you satisfied with the terms of the lease, that it gives sufficient cover to the general public, to the taxpayer and to the patients?
Absolutely.
Without any difficulty?
Without any difficulty.
And you are aware of the concern expressed by some of the clinicians and former clinicians in the National Maternity Hospital. How do you address their concerns?
Well, I'd like my colleagues John and Janice to offer some observations in that theme. John, would you like to go first?
If I may, Deputy, particularly with reference to the Catholic ethos and whether that hangs over everything we're discussing here today. I have been a consultant in St Vincent's for over a decade now, and it is a wholly secular organisation. My appointment in 2010 predated the departure of the Religious Sisters of Charity by several years. So although it's possible, I guess, to argue that in theory a Catholic ethos pertained until their departure, that is not, and I can say that on the record, that is not what applied in practice. The ethos that applied then and that still applies now is seen in our mission statement, revolving around our core values of dignity, compassion, respect, quality and advocacy, whilst striving to maintain excellence in clinical care, research and medical education. And these are the values that you'd expect of any major academic medical institution, either here or around the world. So while I completely understand the genuine concerns of people out there, the assertion that St Vincent's Hospital, or indeed the new National Maternity Hospital at Lem Park, might be vulnerable to influence of a Catholic nature, that is not a hospital that I recognise, nor is it a hospital that I would wish to work in. I personally, and I speak on behalf of the Medical Board of St Vincent's, which includes over 250 physicians, have never had to explain or justify a clinical decision to a religious person or body, ever. The culture at St Vincent's is very simply one that's committed to offering excellence in clinical care to our patients and their families. And that's why we see this venture as a necessary step, but also a natural step given the close collaborative links that already exist between our two institutions in allowing us to deliver state-of-the-art medical care in a world-class facility.
I suppose if I could just add to that, I mean, equally like John, I've been in position for the last 10 years and wrote the cancer submission for protection of life in pregnancy in 2013. And have a very complex patient group in that I'm an oncologist. I deal mainly with breast cancer, so I encounter many young women who have developed cancer during that. We have a significant body of those in Vincent's for a range of different reasons, including the fact that we have significant expertise. We've always enjoyed a really tight relationship with Holles Street in terms of managing the many concerns that they have. And I suppose what I can say uncategorically is I have never had direct representation from the religious order, whether it be directly or indirectly, in terms of trying to influence any of my decisions in that regard.
I presume, well, obviously you're all aware of the regulations incorporated in the legislation, the 2014 legislation, the protection of life during pregnancy, and all that it applies to the hospital groups, regardless. Are you aware of any situation whereby the full extent of that legislation has been denied to women in general?
May I take that one?
Yes,
so, no, they have not been denied. We know that terminations have taken place on the Vincent's campus If you might indulge me for a minute, I suppose in terms of how this would generally happen, let's say a patient comes in to me and she's diagnosed with a cancer during her pregnancy, I will then lift the phone to that obstetrician that has a specific interest in that, gain information from them as to where that procedure, one, the relevance, and in addition to that, where it would be performed. Now, you'll know from the central registration of terminations of pregnancy that is completed centrally from a confidentiality point of view for the patients, that the vast majority of those patients are completed, those terminations are less than 12 weeks. So in terms of where the termination will take place, that is very much guided by the consultant obstetrician, and the more complex ones will take place in our hospital, and that's because they require the multidisciplinary involvement of many other different physicians. But to answer your question, there's never been any interference in that regard since that legal framework was available to us to allow us to complete those procedures, as is entirely appropriate for a very vulnerable patient population.
Thank you.
Might I add, Senator, if possible, I'd like to...
Deputy.
Deputy.
At the last count it was.
My sincere apologies. I, like Janice, have often had to have difficult conversations with patients about the potentially devastating impact of their kidney disease on a longed-for pregnancy, or indeed the implications of a pregnancy on their kidney disease, and where termination may be appropriate. It's often best clinical practice to provide that termination in the site that has adequate and specialist resources. So I guess the point I'm making is that although the perception out there might be that the number of terminations that have occurred in St Vincent's up until this point have been relatively few, you've got to bear in mind where patient care is best served and where the specialists are at present. Once that specialist care is available in Vincent's, I, Janice and my colleagues look forward to being able to offer that service on site in a much more seamless and integrated fashion than the way we do currently. So it's not a matter of sending somebody to Holles Street because of philosophical or theological reasons. It's purely because that's where it's best resourced at present, and that's where the midwives are, that's where appropriate counselling and aftercare can occur.
Similarly, are you aware of the implications of the 2018 legislation arising from the repeal of the 8th, which was dealt with by a committee similar to this at great length? And have you had any difficulty with its implementation in the past 4 years, or do you foresee any difficulty with its continued implication in the future?
Well, I mean, as indicated, Deputy, I think we've certainly said that to date we have had no issue in that regard, no interference, and those procedures have taken place already. And we really look forward to a time where we're co-located with Holles Street, and for those patients who undergo a really traumatic time, that we can walk them down the corridor rather than putting them in a taxi and sending them over to Holles Street.
Thank you. Much discussion has revolved around tradition and ethos and experience of the past and so on and so forth. Are you satisfied that we are looking at a new era, that this is sufficiently guaranteed, that the state's interest is sufficiently guaranteed? And I will include in that, in the event of everybody becoming liquidated, are you satisfied that the state's interest is fully protected insofar as can be done?
Yes.
In any situation?
Yes.
Are you similarly satisfied that no other interest representing the nuns or the Vatican or anywhere else is likely to exert an influence which would in any way impede your responsibility and ability to extend the full range of services required under the legislation for women's health and the protection of life during pregnancy?
Absolutely.
I would ask also whether this, to go back to it just for a second, whether this issue that has been much discussed, that there's a huge difference between ownership and a lease, and we've discussed most of that yet. So are you satisfied that the lease gives you sufficient leverage in the event of any situation developing which has been discussed, some which haven't been discussed at all, of your ability to be able to control what happens in the hospital thereafter? In other words, it just the entire complex is not, or part of the complex, is not sold off separately to an entity that might be in conflict with what you were hoping to do.
Yes, I think the protections in the lease ownership arrangements are designed to ensure that the building proposed is for the women of Ireland, the delivery of maternity care services, both for ourselves and Holles Street.
So you could call it ownership.
No.
I'm going to leave it. I'm watching the clock very carefully, Chairman, and I haven't exceeded, unlike other people, I haven't exceeded the limits.
Sorry, from a state's perspective, absolutely it's ownership.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much for coming in, and I obviously be watching the clock as well. Can you just answer, and I just want clarity on this because it's something I'm not entirely clear on. So obviously in 2011 the HSE found that, you know, the Vincent's Group used funding for a private development, and that all came through PAC and other things like that. And that the security of the loan was some form of charge or lien over all of the land there, and that includes the public hospital. And so and the HSE found obviously that technically no rules were broken, but it wasn't appropriate to be using state assets to fund a private institution, and that's all fair and thing. And there's not so much a question around the fear that this can happen again, because I think things have changed and there's much more stringent things around that. But just in relation to the land that's currently in question, and this is a parcel of the overall land bank there, is that still the subject of some form of charge or lien, a security for the bank debt? Is this particular piece of land involved in that? You know, so one of the conditions of the bank debt is that the debtor should not, you know, sell or gift dispose of any assets against which the debt is secured. So can you just clarify how this, if there is any lien on this particular piece of land, and how that would then interact with that? So I hope that's clear, because someone's explained this to me, and then
as part of the negotiation process with the HSE, we indicated to the HSE that a lender consent will be required to the creation of the lease. So that deals with the security interest, protects the creation of the lease, protects the tenant interest under the lease. So there's a due diligence point that we've agreed to on that with HSE.
Did there have to be an interaction then between the bank, whichever bank you will, around this in terms?
There's an ongoing relationship with the
ongoing
bank.
Relationship.
The bank would have been part of the consent process for the share transfer as well. Yeah.
So they would have consented to it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Just wanted to clarify that. And can you just explain? Sorry, and I'm because obviously there are very similar names involved in things. Can you just clarify exactly who it is? So St Vincent's Group own the land, and St Vincent's Holding are the ones who are holding the shares. So who is it that the Minister would have to approach at all if to say, yo, will you give us the land? Who exactly is it that he would have to go to directly? Well, or is there anyone he can do it, because it's just all tied up in a variety of different things?
No. I mean, any issue to do with the arrangements of any part of the Enham Park campus would in the first instance be the responsibility of the board of St Vincent's Healthcare Group. And that has been the case in terms of the negotiations around perfecting this partnership model to construct this maternity hospital, going back basically to the completion of the Mulvey mediation, the publication of the Mulvey report. So obviously there's been ongoing discussions over that, subsequent to that period, and the board were approached by the Department of Health to expand the lease period from 99 to 150 years and from 150 to 299 years. And our view as a board was that so long as we had a lease ownership model, which thus enabled the state to effectively own the building that they were financing, and I, like any other taxpayer, would want our taxpayers' interest to be protected, but at the same time afforded protections to ourselves and Holles Street as partners in this framework. So that's the...
So it would be St Vincent's Group that the Minister would have to approach?
Yes, absolutely.
And has the Minister approached about that?
Sorry, there was requests at various points over that journey in the last 5 years about the sale of the land. And as I said earlier, for the various decision-making framework, for reasons of patient care and patient mitigation of risk, it was our view that a lease ownership arrangement at the end of the day was satisfactory to all three parties, and I believe it should be and hopefully will be.
Okay, so just because I think a lot of people were throwing this, so it's the Vincent's Group, and the Minister has done that, and that has been, and as you've explained, you've decided that. And can you just clarify a point in of the many documentations that we've read? So just, I don't have it written down, sorry, forgive me, the exact 6 point, whatever it is. So for the first 20 years, if the land was to be sold at any point, the HSE would have the first refusal. That's written into it. And then after 30 years, that first refusal clause, I don't know if that's the exact term, I'm not a legal person, that first refusal piece, if that ceases. So after the 30 years, if the land was to be sold, it doesn't have to be offered first refusal to the HSE, and it can be sold to anyone.
The freehold interest in the land. I think that's very important, but I bow to my lawyer.
It's the freehold. So if in protection of the state investment, the lease, no matter how the freehold transferred, the lease stays in place. It's a distinct interest. During the negotiations, the HSE requested an option to acquire the freehold interest in two particular circumstances. Default circumstances I touched on to Deputy Shortall, and a preemption right, a right of first refusal within the first 20 or 30 years. No, double check that, but I think you're right in the 30. If the property was to be sold within that short period. Okay, and sorry, so I'm still not entirely clear as to what does that mean exactly? Yes. So if Vincent intends to sell the freehold interest, it goes through a process that's set out in the lease within the first 30 years to say they are now going to sell the freehold interest. The HSE can elect at that point, as a matter of contract of the lease, to acquire that interest. So that's in a nutshell. Yeah, and then after 30 years, it's not required to go to the HSE. After 30 years, it falls away. Yeah. Okay. Do you think that is understandable why people are concerned about that? Like, so people are taking screenshots of this agreement and sharing them around and losing their losing their minds, to put it politely, online about it. So that is, I don't know if this is a normal thing within legal documentation. That's causing a lot of concern for people that, the lay speak, if you will, is in 30 years' time, anyone could buy this, and sure, the whole thing would be ripped up and out the window. So can you just clarify a bit around that? If I could, it would be unusual that a tenant would have the right to acquire freehold interest on a on a right of first refusal basis. So there's always and there's always a concern in putting a right out to somebody to acquire an interest in your property for such a long period. There was a lot of discussion around this. The parties felt that 30 years was kind of an adequate period, but then in the future the property can be sold free of that. Okay. But freehold interest in the property can be sold free of that. The lease still stays intact. Okay.
Yeah, may I just make an observation as well, is that you have to remember in the context of this that it is a charity. So it's not that the group can just sell willy-nilly to whoever it chooses. It has to be used for charitable purposes. So the funds would have to come back in. So that, I think, has to be remembered in the context also.
Okay, and you feel that obviously then that charitable purposes is watertight. Sorry, I'm just trying to tease this out, because I know there are people listening to this who have raised these concerns, and I'm as interested as they are in getting a clarity on that. So it would therefore still have to be within that charitable ethos. And do you foresee any situation where in 30 years' time, hopefully we'll all still be around, that this could happen, that there could be a situation? I mean, obviously we don't.
I regard it as quite remote. And the important thing for people to understand that you've characterised is that if in the event that the freehold interest in this land was sold, it doesn't in any way disturb the 299-year lease interest, ownership lease interest that the state has. It's academic, absolutely academic, in substance and indeed mostly in form.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
It's very much an academic point in law. In practice, for people out there who have concerns, I can understand those concerns. and I would try to respond to them by saying that the ownership lease for 299 years, whatever, about 30 years being around, I think we'd all, have to give up on 299, is perfect title for the state. And can't be disturbed.
Yeah, and I hope just obviously because these are written, and I suppose it comes down to an idea of principle. There are people who just believe it should be state-owned on state-owned land, and that should be the future of all capital assets, investment by the state. And obviously then, while you're saying it's an academic exercise in 200 years, but we wouldn't be having this conversation if it was in a different layout. And I just want to reiterate, because I know my time is up in 2 seconds, that this the crux of the problem is that it's just not going to be in.
And could I just say as well, if I may, Chair, that the idea that we have some objection to a state-owned, state-managed, state-run hospital on our campus is bogus. We don't want a voluntary hospital that would be owned by a charity, have a separate board, have a separate, that's separate. We don't want, for reasons of patient care and patient safety, 2 separate hospitals on our campus. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to bring the conversation back to that point that you ended on there, Mr. Menton, in relation to patient care. And I think Professor Walsh outlined the position of women who are seeking terminations within St. Vincent's currently. And I think, while we're discussing it here, and it can be discussed in very abstract terms, I think you brought it back succinctly to what we're talking about. You're talking about people who are very, very sick and are going through a very traumatic time. And I think the gold standard in patient care that we are trying to achieve for women in Ireland, after historic underinvestment, after historic and multiple traumas on women in this country, we're trying to move away. And I really feel that this plan is a step in that direction. You mentioned in your opening statement, Mr. Menton, that if the freehold was sold, that it would create significant risks to patient care. Could you outline exactly what those risks are?
Well, the patient risks are outlined in our fact sheet, and they cover 3 points. One is the need to have seamless, integrated patient care on the same campus as between the new maternity hospital facility and the physical interconnection between that facility and the current university hospital, which allows clinicians like Janice and John and their 248 other colleagues in 50 specialties to very quickly address the needs, and they would be acute medical needs, without reference to anything other than the primacy of the need of the patient, in very simple terms. Maybe, John, you'd like to kind of, on the ground, explain.
Well, briefly, Senator, yes. I mean, I think that the benefits of physical integration are obvious, but also the removal of those operational barriers mightn't seem as obvious, but are very important from a clinical perspective. These often cause confusion, unnecessary delays that augment clinical risk. So our goal here is one of being able to offer the whole suite of services that St. Vincent's enjoys on its campus currently, be that interventional radiology, urology, haematology, nephrology, whatever it might be. And this integration component allows us, without fear or favour, to bring the doctor to the patient rather than the patient to the doctor, and to maintain that patient focus, which is what we're all
just
about.
to be clear, are you saying if that site in the middle of the campus was sold, if the freehold was sold to the state, that there would be an interference of that seamless care?
I think it's likely to throw up unforeseen bureaucratic type of issues that would be difficult to circumvent in a timely fashion, and it would be an unnecessary barrier to delivering effective patient care.
Okay, thank you. I just want to touch on the mortgage issue again, and some colleagues have already touched on that. And perhaps maybe the two lawyers who are before us might perhaps give their opinion on this. How easy would it be to find a banker or another lender to grant a mortgage secured on a freehold subject to a 299-year lease with a rent of €10 per year? Do you think, could you foresee a circumstance where any bank would lend in those circumstances?
I would say, in terms of security on its own, it wouldn't be of any interest to any bank as security. So it's really that's just part of the larger site, and it would be part of that it would be included. But obviously, with the carve out of the long lease in favour of the HSE, so it's really just as part of the campus. It's not. It wouldn't on itself.
So it's an ancillary
interest.
Security. Could you
No.
perhaps maybe just explain briefly why it wouldn't be seen as a good security?
Because all the revenue that's coming from it is €10 per annum, if granted, and it's subject to a third party having the right to occupy it and use it for a hospital. So there's no, for a banker who would be looking for security and income, there's no income on that element of the site. It's just simply, it's part of the larger campus, which is why
Are you saying there that the bank wouldn't be able to realise the full value of the freehold because of the long lease, subject to a 10-year rent?
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you. Just in relation to the in relation to contraception availability within St Vincent's currently, is there anything to prevent you or your colleagues, and I've directed to the two clinicians, prescribing contraception for family planning purposes in St Vincent's currently?
None whatsoever.
Okay, thank you. A lot of commentary has focused around the Minister and a future Minister for Health and what his or her own personal views on issues around family planning, contraception, termination of pregnancy. Is there any way in which a future Minister for Health could interfere via the golden share or otherwise with clinical practice?
No is the simple answer, would be my.
Again, a question to the two clinicians. Can you envisage any mechanism, either now or in the future, whereby religious influence could be exerted upon clinicians? And what would your reaction be if another person outside of the medical team expressed an opinion on your treatment plan?
So, I mean, I can state that over the last 11 years I've had no interference with the religious order at all. I can't see with the absence of them that is going to change. And in terms of the second question you had, if one of my medical team disagreed with me, is that with
somebody outside of the medical staff within the hospital, just somebody from the board or somebody else working within the hospital structure? Would you ever consult or take their opinion into account?
Well, I mean, I suppose in terms of any scenario involving a patient and it's usually that agreement between myself and the patient I'm more concerned in, rather than somebody external. I suppose if I just had even an example of the kind of thing that you were thinking about, I might be able to say more definitively. I mean,
like, for example, Ms Reynolds is on the board.
Yeah.
If she came to you and expressed an opinion about how patients in general or a certain patient should be treated, what would your reaction be?
Well, we have a moral and, Hippocratic oath that we need to follow in terms of best management for the patient, and we continue to do that on a day-to-day basis. So it is a hypothetical question, I guess, in terms of somebody coming to me, but I would continue to complete best practice according to my interaction with the patient, which I have always done.
The answer would be emphatic. No.
Mind your own business.
Exactly. I mean, I think, it is, somebody else's opinion doesn't matter. We are bound by our code of ethics as outlined by the Irish Medical Council, patient confidentiality and the laws of the land. And that's it.
May I just add to that, since I was named as the perpetrator there, and that
and I was only using that as an example.
I do understand, but under no circumstances would any member of the board even consider it within the scope of their remit to be able to approach a clinician and give, make an assertion or make an intervention. Under absolutely no circumstances, just not part of the culture of the board or the hospital.
Okay, thank you.
Clinical independence from the board.
And if I might add to that, Senator, briefly, there has been this assertion that the board members are obliged to maintain and uphold the Catholic ethos of Mother Mary Aikenhead. That is categorically not the case. We've never made any such obligation, and I can categorically deny that for the record.
Thank you very much. Perhaps if Mr O'Reilly could outline to the committee what limitations are placed by charity law on the disposal of the freehold of this site.
Yeah, absolutely. So in considering it for SVHG, if it's disposing of an asset, it uses its assets for charitable purposes in pursuance of its objects, which it's a provision of healthcare facilities. It can't give away an asset unless that's for charitable purposes that meets its objectives. So where the lease is being gifted to the HSE as part of that we're satisfied that meets the requirement for that it's pursuant to charitable objectives to ultimately build the hospital. And as one of the witnesses, I think, touched on last week, that there is a provision in the lease to reflect a charitable law piece that in the event that the property is no longer used for a charitable purpose, that a market rent for the site, disregarding the buildings, it's only a market rent on the site, would be payable. So there'd be some return for the charitable purpose. Sorry, that's a long answer.
That's perfect. And just very briefly, if you could just reiterate to the committee the impact that would be on the leaseholder if the freehold was sold.
No impact. The lease stands alone in law, and there will be no impact.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. We've Alice. Alice Mary Higgins is next.
Thank you very much to the guest, and I'm conscious of the limitation of the time, so I might go back and forth in just 4 sets of questions. The first is returning to the area of concern around that question, the permitted use constraint. And we've heard multiple interpretations here. It was mentioned, I think, by one of the speakers today that was around ensuring it would be a maternity hospital. But there is language which says, legally permissible healthcare services by a maternity, gynecological, obstetrics and neonatal hospital. So there's a line within permitted use that makes it very clear what kind of hospital it is. So the question has been, what exactly is clinically appropriate adding? And again, as an example of the interpretive dangers, we've had one legal advice, I think, to the NMHA. They had first heard it as all clinically appropriate and legally permissible healthcare services. Others have said all clinically appropriate and legally permissible. It's an example of a sentence which is ambiguous and could be seen as giving a double test of clinically appropriate and legally permissible. And very crucially, it's placing that test in legal documents such as leases, and thereby giving a responsibility effectively to both the landlord and the tenant, and the boards indeed of both the landlord and the tenant in terms of its interpretation. So I'd like just to very directly ask, that I believe, apologies if this is correct, but I've heard during the course of this meeting even that Mulvey has said it could be removed. We know the National Maternity Hospital has said it should be removed or defined, and similarly we have had indication from the government that they're looking in that regard. So I'd just like a very clear answer as to whether St Vincent's Healthcare Group are open to the removal of the phrase clinically appropriate. Even as we've just heard, the clinical decisions are being made on the ground to an extent by the master, the Hippocratic Oath and all of that. Why are we putting it into a document which requires board interpretation?
Yeah, sorry. And, as probably touched on in an earlier response, this was a request of the HSE in relation to the drafting of the clinically appropriate.
Because I have limited time, I'm not really interested in the history of the phrase. Okay. I'm interested in your position as St Vincent's Healthcare Group at this moment. There have been calls for it to be defined, and there have been calls for it to be removed. I'd like to know your position on both of those.
Our position is clear in the sense that we're more than happy to engage with our partners, the Department of Health, the Minister and Holles Street, to get a solution that is satisfactory and that addresses the concerns that have been raised. So we have a very open mind as to whether it could be deleted, could be defined or could stay.
Okay, that's useful to know. And then we come to another question of interpretation. In your opening statement, you said that the values of St Vincent's Healthcare Group couldn't be interpreted, in fact, you said, as, relating to a different ethos. But of course, values are interpreted. That's the nature and it's the job. In fact, I'd note that you'll be aware that Dr. Madden and others they specifically stated that boards do have an impact on ethos. And one of the ways is through how values are interpreted. So one of the values, again, listed in the St. Vincent's Healthcare Group is human dignity. It's the #1 value listed, in fact. And there's multiple interpretations in the world on this. We have, within the Charter of the Declaration of Human Rights talks about human beings, who are born, so from the point of birth, being free and equal in dignity. The Dignitas Humanae Institute in Rome, who have a universal declaration on human dignity, state that human dignity applies to every single human being without exception from conception until natural death, and that the most effective means of safeguarding this is recognition through the active participation of the Christian faith in the public square. So again, in terms of those are two interpretations in relation to human dignity. I could give multiples, but I'm only going to give two given time limitations. So what is the interpretation of human dignity as by the St. Vincent's Healthcare Group? I might also ask in relation to the voice of the voiceless, which I think is another of the values. Is that in relation to speaking on behalf of women or those with, what is the interpretation of that?
Melda, would you like to respond?
Yeah, well, I'll try and address some of those points. I suppose, really, in terms of the values, what you're looking at is the culture of the organisation. I maybe when I talk about, when we look at the dignity, the human dignity piece, I think that has to be read in the context of all, which is the case, that all legally permissible.
Sorry, no, just to be clear, legally permissible is separate and we established under clinically appropriate and legally permissible is within the bill. So legally permissible isn't I think we can take that as legally permissible, but I'm asking about the interpretation of the phrase human dignity, as for example it might apply to clinically appropriate.
Sorry, I didn't catch that last point.
The interpretation of the phrase human dignity, I gave two. One which begins from birth, it's the human Charter of Human Rights, and also the Universal Declaration of Human Dignity, which has every single human being from conception.
In the context of the group, it's in the context of delivering patient care, I think, is really where you would have to look at it. Deliver patient care in a dignified way, respecting people's dignity.
I understand that, but you can see what we mean by interpretable, that those are two different interpretations of that phrase that are both in the public domain. And so you can see why it would be relevant. Perhaps you might follow up in writing if you can at this point in terms of what the definition is for one, for example, very specifically begins at birth and one specifically begins at conception.
Well, it's not really, it's not defined as such. It's there as a value for the group.
Yes, so then that value is interpreted in relation to patient care and decisions in respect to patient care, and that of course has the impact on ethos. And again, I would note that this is what Deirdre Madden and others identified, that ethos does matter. And in relation to the voice of the voiceless, as part of, again, this is the new constitution from this April, just to understand how St. Vincent's Healthcare Group will be nominating members to the board of the new entity, how they interpret that.
How St. Vincent's Healthcare Group will be nominating members to the NMH?
As you were nominating members to the new proposed National Maternity Hospital
body,
this is why it's relevant how you interpret these values.
That's the holdings company. Do you want to deal with that?
No.
The nomination.
No, I'm saying not the holding company, the National Maternity Hospital DAC.
Oh, yeah, okay. Okay. I don't know what more I can say other than they're the values that will be applied by the group in terms of pursuing those objectives.
Okay, and I'll just maybe note, if you want to follow up in writing, that really didn't have much of a sense of how voice of the voiceless or human dignity might be interpreted. But that's fine. And as I said, it's another example of removing clinically appropriate might be useful. In terms of the board, do you think it's a little excessive to have 3 members of the St. Vincent's Hospital Group on the board of this new entity? I mean, you are the landlord, you have all the powers that pertain to the landlord, and now you also would have 3 members on the board, and in particular, a rotating chairmanship. And I would just question, isn't a rotating chairmanship really appropriate? Because you are, we've been told it's to represent, ensure a seamless measures in terms of employment and and mind the interests of your other properties on the campus. So chairmanship, which is of course the most senior role in relation to National Maternity Hospital, why would St Vincent's Hospital Group as landlord also seek chairmanship on a rotating basis? Is that something you would be open to not doing?
The construction of the board and the rotation of the chairman reflects the partnership approach to this project. And as a consequence, I think it's fair and reasonable for each partner to have equal representation on the board and to have the opportunity on a 3-year basis to rotate the chairmanship. I think that's perfectly good governance and relatively
It does
similar
create
practice.
a tension, though,
Excuse me?
because it does create a tension because the National Maternity Hospital, effectively, if they're there as a tenant and they're a tenant of a landlord, that having the landlord chair the board of the tenant does seem to create somewhat of a tension. I just might add 2 or 3 others in terms of the contracts.
Well, could I comment further on
just to give you a chance to kind of answer a couple at the same time.
Yeah.
The 30-year, and I would appreciate to answer in terms of the chairmanship again, the 30-year option for the state, why not 70 years? We've been told 70 years is the expected lifespan of the first hospital, but why not 70 years? In terms of that first lifetime, wouldn't that give somewhat more of a security to the state that they could buy the freehold? And I would note, any of the reasons you said that were concerned in relation to selling the freehold to the state would surely apply to selling the freehold to somebody else.
Go ahead.
I just missed the last bit.
I would say you mentioned your concerns in relation to selling the freehold to the state. Would that not also apply to selling it to someone else? Or if it doesn't, it only applies at this point before the hospital is built, then why not continue to have a first refusal on the freehold for the 70 years of the first hospital?
It is very unusual to leave a right of first refusal out for so long by a property owner. This was part of the various concessions that were made in relation to the documents, and this was a concession given to HSE to recognise some of their concerns in the short term.
Okay,
I mean, it's
Alice
a very
Mary,
unusual
I have to bring you to an end.
I just had a...
Alice Mary, please, I need to move on.
Okay,
you keep
that's
fading
fine.
in and out as well.
I'm sorry, apologies. Can I just ask one last question, which is an exit?
We're going to have a second round, so you maybe come down for the second round. Okay, I'm going to move on to... Sorry. Senator Martin Conway.
And first of all, I'd like to thank our guests for attending here today. I think certainly some of the clarity that was brought to the discussion by the clinicians is very welcome. But I do think it's important as well to put on the record that the number of actual terminations that have taken place in St Vincent's between 2016 and 2021 is less than 5, which would be anywhere between 0 and 4. And this is in reply to a parliamentary question last October. Furthermore, I think Senator Clifford Lee spoke about contraception, and in the same reply, it was stated clearly by Paul Gallagher, who was the head of midwifery, my understanding, and nursing midwifery, that sterilisation does take place in Vincent's when clinically required, which I think is important, and that sterilisation as an exclusive procedure is not available in St Vincent's. Now, I think that's important to put on the record as well. So I just give the clinicians maybe a quick minute to respond to those figures, and then the remainder of my questions will be for Mr Minton.
Okay, so I start? So, thank you, Senator Conway. I suppose I did allude to the fact earlier that you are correct. Only a small number of termination of pregnancy have happened on the Vincent's campus, but they have happened. So, therefore, the number we know is 5.
No. According to the parliamentary question reply, which is part of the record of the House, it's less than 5. So that's anywhere between 0 and 4.
Well, it is definitely, it has occurred on the Vincent's campus. You have had some testimony, I believe, regarding that earlier in the week from Mary Higgins.
We didn't get figures, I'm afraid.
Just in terms of it occurring, so not 0.
Less than 4. I would suggest.
So in terms of why those numbers are so low, that is because those particular ones were complex and they were completed in combination with other physicians that are required as part of that multidisciplinary care. However, we discussed the need for termination intermittently, but on a regular basis, and much of that, as Dr. Holian had outlined, does take place over in the maternity hospital by virtue of the fact that they have more resources available and have proper psychological care for those patients who are undergoing something that's very difficult.
Sterilisation wouldn't, with respect, fall into that category, but what worries me is the word clinically required. So if it's not clinically required, but if the patient so wishes to go ahead to have it because they deem it in their best interests, would it be provided? Probably not, I would suggest.
Within the current legal framework, that is a permitted procedure, and therefore it should be provided.
Yeah. Anyway, I'll move on to Mr. Minton. Mr. Minton, would you describe yourself as a hands-on chairman? Would you consider yourself, let's say, more an executive chairman than a non-executive chairman?
No, I wouldn't.
What would you describe yourself as?
I would say that I'm very active in my role as a chair, but the idea of being an executive chairman doesn't have...
So would you be briefed on all strategic decisions that the hospital and the group would be considering? You would be aware of any major policy initiatives or engagements or discussions with third parties and so on, on major issues?
They would certainly... the board and myself would be aware of them as communicated by management, or indeed if I had participated in some of those discussions as appropriate.
That's okay. And I know that Deputy Shortall has spoken to you about the debt, and you put up a vigorous defence of the debt. But I would describe it as perilous, because you're talking about 452 million in debt. You have 200 million in assets. The situation, probably through no fault of yours, as a result of COVID, is deteriorating, and the 2021 accounts will be very interesting reading in terms of the deterioration. I'm going to put it to you now, Mr. Minton, that your lenders and your bankers would have had a view as to whether the site should have been gifted to the state or not, and that there would have been engagement between Vincent's and your bankers and your lenders and the people that you depend on for solvency as to whether the site would be gifted or not. Am I correct?
No.
There was no engagement whatsoever, or no discussion whatsoever. Your financial lenders had no concern as to what was going to happen. What is probably the most valuable piece of land in the city of Dublin?
We consulted and were granted permission for the change in control.
No, hang on a second.
Okay.
Your initial answer to me was no. Now you're telling us that you consulted. No, which is it?
We consulted on the share transfer because we were required under the provisions of our loan agreement and these are standard change in controls, to get their permission to effect the share transfer. On the land issue, discussion...
The ownership of the land issue.
Yeah, well, indeed.
Yeah. And bearing in mind now, you're at an Oireachtas committee.
Yes.
And it's important to give correct information.
Oh, I honestly intend absolutely to do so. Absolutely. Absolutely intend to do so. And am, I believe.
Go ahead,
So as regards our Bank of Ireland, who are our financial partners, their involvement in the group is strictly with the St Vincent's Private Hospital. We are performing, our loan arrangements with them have been compliant in performance in terms of capital repayments, in terms of meeting our interest bills like any other lender. The reference made to the variation in covenants goes back to the fact that those variations relate to covenants that were written in 2010. Then we had the recession, and as a process we need to technically revise those waivers on a periodic basis. And as Deputy Shortall alluded to, I think they were in the next revision is in about 3 or 4 months' time.
3 or 4 months,
And those discussions have been ongoing, and we have had very positive reaction from the Bank of Ireland that those waivers will continue through the end of next year. So we are absolutely satisfied, Senator, that our performance vis-à-vis our loan obligations is completely in accordance with the loan repayment schedule, the interest payment schedule, and, as I explained as best I could, with the requirements of covenants.
So you can categorically assure this committee and the people of Ireland who are looking in that the banks at no stage persuaded you or suggested, either covertly or overtly, formally or informally, that it wouldn't be a good idea to gift this piece of land to the state?
There was no discussions.
You're sure of that, yeah?
To the best of my knowledge and belief, I absolutely am, yes.
Well, I would think that maybe you should reflect on that. But we'll move on to another question I have.
Sorry.
No, I'll just like, are you 100% sure that there was no engagements or discussions?
That the banks had discussions with us, formally, informally, covertly or otherwise, suggesting that we shouldn't give the land to the state. I can categorically assure you that.
Okay, take your word on that. Just in terms of the overall business plan, because clearly, like many other businesses, you have been under pressure, and like that's not unusual. We've been through a worldwide pandemic. At any point over the last number of years, did the St Vincent's Hospital Group engage in discussions to sell the business to an international entity?
No, we didn't.
And there was
to sell the business, absolutely not.
Okay, that's fair enough. I've just one other question, and that's in this whole area of clinically appropriate. Perhaps you might advise us on when the engagement or discussion on clinically appropriate first emerged, because clearly, to be fair, you've been clear that it didn't come from your side. You know, at what point did the clinically appropriate, which has caused a lot of problems and concern and difficulties for people, when was that put on the table as something that needed to be included in the Constitution?
Indicate that.
Yeah, I think it was in recent months. If you'd like us to reply to exactly when that was, I'll gladly do so.
Yeah, I would think it would be useful, because I think, you know, while there has been a lot of explanation as to the context of it, I think in order to, I suppose, enshrine public confidence in this, which is what we're trying to do, and don't get me wrong, I am supportive of the project, but we need to ensure that, you know, the public are brought with us, and our job is to ask the questions on behalf of the public, because unfortunately the public don't have the option of coming in here and putting the questions to you. So, as others have said, this isn't in any way personal, but we have a duty of care to ask the questions, and I just think that this clinically appropriate issue needs further clarity from all parties, including yourselves.
Okay, yeah, I'll come back to you hopefully very shortly.
Oh,
okay, great. Colin.
That's fine, thanks.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all our guests for appearing here today and giving us the information that we are looking for. One of the people that was in with us last Thursday has now decided to describe freehold and leasehold, that the freehold is like owning a car and the leasehold is like owning a caravan. Therefore, when you own a caravan, you can't set out the directions you're going in. And, you know, taking that into logical, taking that on from there, that means that there are now over 300,000 people living in houses, which technically, in accordance to this interpretation, are technically living in caravans. And I'm just wondering, could you just set out the difference in relation to leasehold? As I understand it, leasehold is a separate legal entity from the freehold. So in other words, you have a freehold legal entity and you have a leasehold legal entity. And the leasehold is taken from the freehold interest. Therefore, when you get a leasehold interest of 299 years, you have full control of the property, because I think there's a misinterpretation out there. And this is, for instance, the person goes on to say, another control lost over the asset through the lease's terms, which would not apply if the stay under the freehold, is that St Vincent's can mortgage the new NMH building. That's what's up there, that's in writing, it's up there, and this is from a legal advisor who was with us here last Thursday. So I think it's important that we now clarify what is the legal interest. The HSE are getting a 299-year lease, am I correct? Do they have full control over that building?
Yes.
And my understanding is that they're then giving a licence to the new NMH board. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And can I just say then, in relation to the building itself, can St Vincent's Group mortgage the building as a separate entity?
No, we can
And maybe you might give clarification on that.
I think, just at the risk of repeating what was said earlier, we can only mortgage the freehold reversionary interest, so the interest out of which the leasehold has been created, but it will be subject to that 299-year lease, so there will be no impact on.
No, but I think what people are looking for clarification, because this is set out in writing that St Vincent's can mortgage the NMH building. Is that correct or is it not?
No. No.
It's a separate legal entity. The building is going to be a separate legal entity from the interests of St Vincent's. Okay? So that is actually incorrect in setting that out. Am I right?
Yes. Well, it's I suppose I don't want to get too bogged down in the details, but the site on which it's been built would continue to be owned by the St.
I'm aware of that, but the building itself cannot be mortgaged by St Vincent's.
No.
Okay. Can I just also say that this legal person has said also that the building will always belong to the landlord, St Vincent's.
No,
so while the lease is in place,
HSE.
am I correct that the HSE actually physically owns the building?
Yes.
Okay, so that is the position?
Yes.
Okay. Can I, just in relation to the whole issue about, a lot of people have been on about why can't we, the state go for compulsory purchase, say for argument's sake, if the government decided in the morning or decided tomorrow that they're not going to proceed, that they want a freehold interest, and therefore the option St Vincent's decides not to, St Vincent's Holdings decides not to enter into negotiations, it goes down the compulsory purchase road. What then would be the reaction of St Vincent's Hospital to that proposal?
Well, I think it would completely unravel the partnership framework that's on the table in front of the government to make decisions in conjunction with ourselves. I think it would set the project back 10 years plus. I think it would do, it would be an extraordinarily negative development in everybody's agreed objective to improve maternity care for women in Ireland. And I think that without prejudice to a full consideration and discussion at a board level, my own personal reaction as a director is that we would seek to challenge the CPO.
Okay.
Because we'd like to keep the integrity of our cabinet.
I'm not sure whether you've seen the opinion of Stephen Dodd, Senior Counsel. A lot of people are quoted as saying this is a way of dealing with this. He's given advices. My interpretation of his opinion is not the same as what's up on social media. Maybe the legal advisor might give us some.
I haven't seen that opinion, but I heard reference to evidence that was given or witness statements that was given here last week that he highlights the constitutional issue with the current HSE CPO powers. And I don't disagree with that. But he also, so there would be a legislative piece to seek to remedy that. But I think where a body is seeking to CPO, it's not just what powers it has, it also has to show that the CPO is proportionate. And I think that would be a difficult point for the HSE to show, where it's being gifted a 300-year lease of a site, that it's proportionate for the state to exercise a compulsory power to acquire freehold. So I think it'd be hard, I think, for the state to justify.
So in other words, you're saying because the state is getting the HSE are getting a 299-year lease, then it would be very hard to argue that we're not getting full control, and
I
that.
think so. Yeah, sorry, yeah, I think so. Yeah.
And that the state would have a difficulty on that issue alone.
Yeah.
Okay. Can I just ask you as well, because there seemed to have been misinformation provided at the meeting on Thursday, where the word demise is set out in the lease, and it clearly sets out that the St Vincent's Holding Group is demising the property to the HSE, or the leasehold interest for 299 years to the HSE. And when the legal expert was asked by another deputy, does the St Vincent's still retain ownership of the building? The answer to that was yes, that they do. And maybe you might just translate into layman's terms the word demise. As I understand it, it means we're transferring the control for 299 years. Would that be correct interpretation?
Yeah, I think that's fair. So the freeholder is stepping away from the property for the 299 years. So if we take the freehold here, and the depth of enjoyment of the property is there, this is the lease, and the freeholder is stepped away by granting the lease, though there are covenants in the lease for the tenant to continue to enjoy the property. So subject to the lease, but effectively, for as long as the tenant complies with the lease, it has the lands for the 299 years.
And in relation to complying with the lease clearly sets out that it must be used for medical purposes. In what circumstances could the landlord suddenly go in and take control of the property or forfeit the lease?
I think where there's a number of points where if the hospital isn't built, for example, there's an ability to take the property back. If there is a material breach of the lease, or if the material breach of the lease, like an abandonment of the building, like if partly built and then abandoned, the property can be taken back now as well.
But as long as it's providing healthcare in that building.
Sorry, Deputy. Yeah. So the obligation of HSE is to provide the public healthcare facility in accordance with the lease.
And there are no other circumstances in which the landlord could actually physically take control of this building from the HSE?
No, there are just, and I was referred to in our earlier piece, there are a couple of provisions in an option agreement if it's sought to exercise certain landlord and tenant rights, that the lease could be taken back in those circumstances, but other than that, no.
Just outline those circumstances, just.
Yeah, in one of the option agreements which was touched on last week, if the HSE sought to exercise landlord and tenant right to renew the lease beyond 300 years or to change the user, then there is an ability for SVHG to take it back then.
But that's only if the HSE decided that they wanted to use the property for an alternative purpose. But no other grounds can they take back?
That's it, that's it.
So the analysis that I started off with of the car and a caravan doesn't fit in?
Yeah, I think not to be glib, but I think you have two caravans, and you're handing a caravan for 299 years to one person, and subject to certain conditions, for as long as you do certain things with this caravan, it's yours for 299 years in its simplest form. So the actual use and enjoyment of the property will be at the tenant level, it will be with HSE.
Okay. Thank you.
Could I just add a comment, because there's been a lot of weeds about legal provisions, legal this, that and the other. Our objective in Vincent's Healthcare Group is to have this project proceed, to have this building built, owned by the state under a lease ownership arrangement to improve maternity care and neonatal care for women in Ireland. All of the various legal points that have been validly raised are just to ensure that that happens and that the building will be used for the healthcare purpose that has been constructed and funded by the taxpayer.
But you also agree that there's a lot of incorrect information out in the public domain, in that the message being sent out there is like as if St Vincent's controlled the building, even though the lease is given to the HSE?
Well, all we can do is testify here today and testify to the contrary. Okay. Thank you, Chairman.
Right, thanks.
I'm just going to bring the other members in just before I bring them in. Like, it's been a long negotiation between yourselves and HSE, government, in relation to what were the mains? What would you, in yours, representing your group, what were the main stumbling blocks? Was it the land issue, the freehold issue? Like you're saying in your statement today, ownership, the land, Elm Park campus lands is essential to ensuring ongoing provision of best hospital care and so on. So was that the stumbling block all along? Or was it other issues?
I think basically it was to try and get an agreement between two voluntary hospitals and the state to, on the one hand, respect the interests of the state, which is investing substantial amounts of taxpayers' money in this project, to respect the interests of NMH and that their clinical, their operational and their financial independence would be respected when they transfer to Elm Park. And from our perspective, it was to protect the interests of our ability to provide services to our patients. And there was a multiplicity of issues around that. And I'd like to compliment Kieran Mulvey for the mediation and his report. And the fact of the matter is that while there's various legal agreements about this matter and that matter, the reality is that the Mulvey report, if the government give a go-ahead, will be essentially implemented in full, save for a rebalancing of representation on the board. The original Mulvey report called for 4 board representation from Vincent's, 4 from the Holles Street Trust and 1 independent expert, and that's been rebalanced now in the past year between 3, and 3, which is a representation from each partner. And it also, in the Mulvey report, talked about a lien over the building. And that certainly has, to answer your point directly, has consumed quite a lot of discussion as to how to give effect to the protection of the state's interest.
I'm entitled to ask a question, Roisin, if that's okay with you. And just the significant risk to patient care. You're first on the list up, so I don't know what the big problem is. Significant risk to patient care.
I was hoping, Dr. Holian referred to an illustration of that risk where, I suppose to summarise, where the doctor comes to the patient rather than the patient comes to the doctor. And any impediment to that simple observation, but crucially important to the patient, is what concerns us.
But I don't understand. I don't see the linkage between, one, say, the state owned the land and,
well,
some other
if the state owned the freehold of the land, then we've no further interest in a substantial part of our campus upon which will be built a very fine facility that is designed to be integrated with the university hospital. So you would have 2 systems of governance, 2 management, you'd have 2 of everything. And our concern is that that would impede upon, given the nature of the proposed design of the building, upon our ability to
but a risk to patient care?
Yeah.
You're saying?
Yes, I do believe that, yeah. And I don't know, John, do you want to comment further?
Not particularly, but I guess just to cite some examples of why this initiative is so urgently required, that there have been many instances where I've been called upon by my colleagues in Holles Street to give a clinically urgent opinion in the setting of a high-risk pregnancy, and it is extraordinarily challenging at times to make it from Vincent's to Holles Street in a time frame that the patient deserves. So removing not just the physical impediments but the operational impediments that ownership alludes to are going to ensure that our focus, which is on delivering effective and timely patient care, is remedied.
Okay. I'll move on to Roisin Shorter.
Thanks very much, Chair. I'd just like to check back, Mr. Menton, on a couple of comments you made, as I understand them. You said that the last direct conversation you had about the state purchasing the site was about 5 years ago with Jim Breslin, is that right?
No, sorry. I directly had discussions about that topic, and in significant detail. But to be fair, and I need to correct perhaps that point. So I think last June, I know that this issue became a topic again. I know that the Minister met our shareholders to discuss the topic.
Okay, were you present at that meeting?
No, I wasn't. No.
Okay, and what was the view of the shareholders at that stage?
They referred the matter to ourselves because we are the owners of the land.
Okay.
And there was a very brief communication, is the way I would describe it, between ourselves and the department and the HSE, where our position of 5 years ago remained constant.
Okay, so you weren't asked directly in recent times about selling the site. Is that the case?
No, I don't think you could characterise that as that. There was no serious or meaningful discussions, if I may, because our position had remained unaltered, and I think that was very well known.
Thanks very much. So look, in relation to the offending phrase clinically appropriate, the Minister is saying he's no difficulty with putting in a definition or removing that completely. Holles Street have said the same, and as I understand it, you're saying the same. So can you just confirm that you wouldn't have a difficulty in removing that phrase from all of the documents or providing a definition in all of the documents?
No, I wouldn't. I think that's a fair
that's grand.
summary.
And just earlier on, when I was talking about the floating charges, you indicated that floating charges don't apply to all assets?
Oh, yes, because, for example, our clinical services building, which most people in the room familiar with the campus would be the University Hospital, and a recently constructed specialist ward block, which is the Nutley Wing. They are the taxpayers' interest in those buildings is protected under a grant agreement.
Okay.
And obviously they are not available.
Okay, but those charges would apply to all other buildings and sites
that are not state financed
currently and in the future,
as long as they're not state financed and that we don't breach any.
Okay, and just my final point then is in relation to this issue of ownership of the building, and you know, in the lease there is the first schedule which talks about any buildings on the site. That's what the premises means. And then under landlord mortgaging, it says, and this is one of the covenants that it refers to about yourselves, having covenants with the tenant not to mortgage or charge the landlord's freehold interest in the premises, including buildings, without the prior written consent of the tenant, right, which would be the HSE?
Yes.
Okay, so if the HSE consents to you mortgaging the site and the building, you could do it sooner than 20 years. And, sorry, just the other phrase is, such consent not to be unreasonably withheld or delayed, right? So in circumstances, say, where St Vincent's could get into serious difficulty, okay, financially, as you have been from time to time,
that accept that.
Stop. Well, okay.
If I could respond to that, and I'd refer you back to my previous answer in relation to this, just to be absolutely clear.
Okay, I do recall your previous answer, okay? And I also recall very clearly where St Vincent's mortgaged the public hospital to build a private hospital without any approvals. So you do have form in this regard.
And what we're looking at is legal documents in front of us in 2022.
Okay. You will also know that the head of the HSE referred to St Vincent's private as having a parasitic dependence on the public hospital.
I can't comment on that, Deputy.
Okay, but some of us remember that very clearly, and that's our concern now.
Yeah, but
are you denying that the licence vitiates the ownership issue in the lease?
You've asked the question, let them respond, please.
A former Director General made those comments. I was the chairman then and still now, and I wholly rejected what was asserted and what was alleged. Vincent's Private Hospital is an independent entity within the Svhg. It doesn't receive any funds from the Irish taxpayer.
I didn't say
nor
that,
does it receive
Mr.
funding.
But you mortgage the public hospitals to raise money for the private.
Roisin, please, will you let the man respond? You've asked him a question. Please let him respond.
Those arrangements that you refer to that come out of the CAG report, I wasn't party to any of those decisions one way or the other. And the very important point to make is that all of those were remedied and perfected because at the time, there was no, as I understand it, there was no appropriate legal documentation from the state to exercise the protection of the state's interests. So
Where your debts come from?
John Lahart's next.
Private hospital
I'm moving
building.
on. John Lahart's next.
Which
sorry,
John.
your debts,
funding. Yes,
your debts come from building the private hospital.
Will you let the member speak?
Yes or no answer.
Please move on. John.
So there is provision made that in relation to the public hospital, any of the properties in the public hospital, that the HSE would have first refusal on the sale of those. Isn't that correct?
Yes,
yeah, for a period of time. So there's no Vatican papers, it seems. There's no. You're saying you couldn't go down the Bon Secours route of a foreign healthcare group coming in and buying the entire thing. You can't mortgage the new building. You can just mortgage the freehold of it, which really isn't worth.
Yes.
Okay. The Mary Aikenhead values are kind of, I can take the interpretations put on from an extreme, but the Mary Aikenhead values are kind of, seems to me, even a humanist could stand over the values. They're not Catholic doctrine. Okay. No. And I assume that the existing private and to some degree public hospital will reflect the history of that contribution. I think you can't cancel all of that, but the new maternity hospital will have no reference to any of
exactly
of that. Okay. Why didn't the nuns decide sell it? Just sell this whole thing. We're getting out. Sell the entire thing to another healthcare group.
Well, I can't give you a definitive answer because I don't advise the sisters as to what they should or shouldn't do with various interests.
But I presume just
I think
simplistic history was the religious sisters established the hospital back in the day. And then as religious numbers began to diminish, they brought a lay element in to help them run. And 20 years ago, that was set up into a formal St. Vincent's Hospital healthcare group. Correct.
Yes,
nuns are kind of just nominally, are they there at that stage, or are they?
As board members, I would submit.
Okay, and then they're gone as board members, probably.
Executive there in executive roles.
So, I mean, they could validly, and I'm just trying to be objective, they could say, well, actually, essentially what we've done at €10 a year, it is a gift to the state, because there's no cost to the state, but the state doesn't own the land into perpetuity. The HSE has a lease in it for 299 years. What, that transition, this goes to Deputy Smith's question, that transition from the Religious Sisters of Charity into the St. Vincent's healthcare group, what was that about? That was about continuing the ethos, wasn't it?
Just, if I may, you might just repeat your question. I
Yeah,
distracted.
so that change from, you know, that evolution from the sisters being
and the Catholic
exclusively
ethos.
kind of in charge, and then the establishment of the St. Vincent's healthcare group.
Yes.
That essentially took over from the Religious Sisters of Charity.
Directly. Their direct interest, yes.
Yeah. So I suppose the question is, I suppose that group has a Catholic flavour to it. There's nothing wrong with having a Catholic flavour to it, by the way. And I think this is what maybe Deputy Smith is after, is that the spirit that permeates that, is that influential in anything that the healthcare group does?
I don't believe so.
No, you know, but I suppose when you say you don't...
I'm having difficulty hearing.
Sorry, meeting going on here.
Sorry. Yeah, I suppose it's...
Sorry, I beg your pardon. If you could just repeat your line of thinking, and I'll do my level best to respond.
Yeah, I suppose what I'm saying is that, you see, the Religious Sisters of Charity, I presume, believe that they've handed their legacy into good hands.
I hope so.
Okay, but they, I suppose, is it into hands that reflect a particular denominational ethos now? It did it and does it now?
No, what they, my response to your question observation is as follows. What the Sisters of Charity wanted to do in the construction of the share transfer is to ensure that Vincent's fulfills its mission of looking after people and getting the best outcomes for our patients. The one huge difference.
So that's kind of a legacy.
Yes.
Is that okay? All
Yeah,
right, 'cause it's easy.
they wanted to leave healthcare, but they didn't want Vincent's to leave healthcare, is the way I would put it.
Okay. And the final thing I just want to say.
And the big difference is that direction of travel was to have Vincent's continue in healthcare, but without any ethical or religious bias, is the way I would
Look, that's an
recite it.
important point, and I suppose it's subjective whether people believe it or not. That you had the Religious Sisters of Charity had quite a formidable footprint in healthcare in that part of Dublin. Numbers were kind of, you know, diminishing, and they wanted to ensure that their legacy in healthcare wasn't forgotten, even though they were handing it over into an organisation and structure that over time would simply not reflect the Religious Sisters of Charity, except those values, not doctrine, those values of dignity, compassion, and, okay, that people have taken issue with. Just a final figure, it's important to put on the record in relation to the numbers of terminations, because I have the last figures for terminations, that, you know, the Minister is obliged to get these. There was over 6,500 terminations in 2020. There was 2,414 of those were in Dublin, and only 1.8% of those took place in a hospital setting, which leaves about 10%, the figure that you've mentioned, of those took place in Vincent's, which, given that it's not really a maternity hospital, the public hospital in that, or the private hospital in that sense, sounds to me reasonable that 10% of the terminations that took place in a hospital setting took place in Vincent's. Thanks, Chair.
You're next.
Oh, thanks, yeah. On the same vein as what the last deputy was asking you about in terms of the role of the sisters again. Have they any shares or their nominees any shares anywhere in the St Vincent's Holdings or St Vincent's Healthcare Group?
No, categorically no.
No, and do they make any financial gain out of walking away?
No.
They sell them? Did they sell the shares on to somebody?
No, they sold it to the new holding company, St Vincent's Holdings.
And did they make a lot of money out of that?
No.
No, did they make any money?
They made no money.
Made no money. They sold it, but they made no money.
Yeah, they transferred the shares.
Transferred without selling?
Oh no, they sold the shares legally for nil consideration, as well as we granted them an indemnity, which Donna might cover. But in Conor Gardner language...
Please, yeah, that's what people want to hear.
Okay. They sold the shares for virtually no consideration.
For no money?
For no money, yeah.
So you can sell something for no money, can you?
In Conor Gardner language, we didn't give them a big cheque.
Did you give them €1?
Did we even give them €1?
So how do you sell something and not get money for it? Or something?
Yeah, well,
a dozen eggs or something?
Get my legal...
It was gifted, and I'll see if I can respond to that. It was nominal, what was paid, absolutely nominal.
And you can't remember the nominality?
I can't remember, but it would be considered a gift.
Okay, so they're gone off the picture, and now we have evolutionary from religious to a nothing. I'm after getting people sending me photographs within the last hour of crucifixes and mass stands and different stuff around the hospital. And I'll just ask you again, when do you hope to have all the iconography removed from the hospital now that it's evolved into a secular hospital?
Well, as I said earlier, the final transaction only was concluded a couple of weeks ago. Certainly the board have as an objective to reflect the fact that we are a secular organisation and that we would anticipate moving along that direction in terms of iconography.
Doesn't answer my question. But anyway, look, that's my second time to answer. I'm going to run. When one asks a question like when, you could say a month, 2 months, 10 months, 10 years. You could answer me that way.
Sooner rather than later.
Okay.
Over the next 3 to 6 months.
Right, grand. So the next 2 to 3 months, you hope to have all that religious stuff moved?
Sorry, I said 3 to 6, and we will address that issue in the rest of our sector.
Grand. Now, the next question I have for you is, earlier on there was a discussion here, I can't remember who was asking the question, if a member of the board would approach a clinician ever about their decision, and it was said no, categorically no, that would not happen. Could you envisage a situation where a clinician would approach the board about their decision, given the very limited laws we have around abortion? For example, in the case of fatal fetal abnormality, if an infant can survive more than 28 days outside the womb, then the abortion should not be allowed. It would be illegal, and the clinician who might carry it out, if he or she thought that this infant would not survive more than 2 months, would be subject to a possibility of prosecution and a jail sentence. Can you envisage any situation where a clinician might approach the board and that somewhere in the back of all this, particularly our own appointment, given that the nuns trusted you so much, would be a Catholic head that would be saying, well, what do we do here?
Well, I'd like to ask the clinicians to maybe cover that.
Well, I would say that the board would not be the appropriate forum for that. For instance, it does have a medical ethics committee which includes ethics professors, clinicians, international experts on human reproduction, and that would be a far more appropriate forum to bring that type of initiative.
Interesting. Does that medical ethics committee have any of the ethics of the original Mother Mary Aikenhead group?
No. No.
And is there any
not.
chance you could send that medical ethics constitution to members of the Oireachtas?
I'm sure we could do that without
That would be gratefully received, and I think all the information you're giving us is very interesting. But at some point, we need to put pressure on the government to give us more time to deal with the rest of this stuff. There's a lot of stuff outstanding and a lot of stuff emerging that's causing concern.
Thanks, Brad. Bernard Torkins.
Chairman, thank you. Just 2 minutes, as much as you can say, 2 minutes, but however, 2.5 minutes. We will, I presume that everybody is of one opinion in relation to the provision of the much needed maternity support services that are needed in this country, that it needs to be updated. It needs to be updated as a matter of urgency. It needs to be updated to meet the health requirements of women and children in our society. And I would just like you to confirm that this is the case, and to emphasise, if at all possible, the extent to which it is important to proceed as early as possible.
I couldn't emphasise it strongly enough.
Can I ask another question? It's in relation to gifting. The word of gifting has, and the phrase has come up several times in recent times. And incidentally, I acknowledge that the various religious institutions of all shades of opinion have gifted to a fair extent in the past, in both hospitals, other facilities, sports facilities, schools, etc. And I think that we need to keep that in mind. But in relation to the gift in particular, the merit of a gift, what is it subject to? Is it subject to taxation? Is it subject to a particular issue, hence the necessity to have a payment, a nominal payment or otherwise? So are we aware of what might happen? For instance, in family property, there are strict rules in gifting to members of the family and associates. So does that apply in this particular case?
Without getting too legal about it, but I think for there to be an effective contractual transfer of the issue, there has to be some consideration. And so I think in the case of this particular share transfer, it was the indemnity was the kind of the benefit that passed. So there has to be the offer, the acceptance, and then the benefit that accrues, and that's what happened in this situation. And that's supposed to trying to make it very simplistic for this.
Last question, Chairman, is in relation to the extent to which the investment by the taxpayer on the site is protected with the passage, throughout the passage of time. And for instance, is the taxpayer protected adequately in the event of circumstances, known or unknown, that might affect the arrangement?
Well, I believe so. And it's in our interest that the taxpayer is protected because we want the building to be there. Maybe its useful life is only 70, 75 years. The lease is a lot longer than that. But, you know, it's not unreasonable to assume that after 75 years, the building needs to be remodelled, rejuvenated, and that would be a matter of negotiation between the three parties in the same way it has been, albeit for a longer period of time. Hope the next negotiation would be much shorter.
Thanks, Chairman.
Thanks very much. Alice Mary Higgins.
Yeah, just to pick up where you mentioned another negotiation, which I'm concerned about it, because but as it seems in the lease, there's simply a requirement that there would be maternity hospitals, and that there would be, and if there's not a maternity hospital, there's a return to the 850,000 rent, which is the actual rent, waived to 10, but it is the actual rent. And we mentioned earlier, when that might apply. Permitted use is one of the forfeiture events whereby the site will be given back. Our St Vincent's Holding Group, our hospital group, may reclaim the site, as was mentioned. And of course, permitted use includes that phrase, clinically appropriate, the undefined phrase. So you mentioned the idea of a negotiation in 75 years. I'd like to be really clear what would happen. So is it the case that either the state will build a new hospital that you will be happy with, or the state would return to market rent for the remaining, say, 210 years? And sorry, just to add on that, and if you could also just confirm in terms of permitted use, this is another 75 years. You mentioned 100 years, National Maternity Hospital wants to move on, 170 years, the Sisters of Charity have moved their model on. What's the exit mechanism for the state if in 75 years the state says we actually do want to leave? Because as I see it at the moment, it's only in the case of insolvency that they have an option, of the St Vincent's Hospital Group, that they have an option to leave.
Well, I'll ask Donal to answer that question, but I would just recall the fact that the original lease term was 99 years with an option for an extra 50, and then we were approached by the government to extend the lease for a much further period of time, which we did.
I think the terms of the lease were a lot worse than anybody expected, I think, when perhaps that was being discussed, in terms of the 850,000 liability, for example, potentially, if the state doesn't continue to have hospitals.
I'll let Donal cover that particular point.
Just in relation to the 850,000, and I think it's one of the witnesses last week reflected charity law points in relation to that, and having to recover the rent if it's applied to a non-charitable use. In the 70 years, and I know you asked this question a few times last week, so let me answer it in relation to, at 70 years, it will be up to the state to decide if it's going to rebuild. That will be the state's decision. There isn't a compulsion on the state pursuant to the lease to rebuild at the end of the life cycle of the building. But it does have an obligation to continue to use it as a hospital. So that will be a state decision.
Just to be clear, we keep saying use it as a hospital as the obligation. The obligation is permitted use, which includes reference to using it as a hospital and includes reference to clinically appropriate. So just permitted use.
I'm just going to segue to those 2 points. I know there are 2 distinct points. So I'm just shorthanding it into the hospital, if that's okay.
And that would return to market rent at that point. So we would have a contract for, say, the 210 years for market rent to St Vincent's Hospital Group if the state chose not to. There isn't an exit mechanism.
There isn't an exit mechanism without agreement for as long as the state complies with its obligations under the lease in relation to permitted user. I'll shorthand that to operating a hospital. It pays nominal rent.
Yeah, and then if it doesn't, it pays market rent for the remaining period.
Market rent for the site.
And can I just ask one thing? That you mentioned, and just pick up on the Chair's point, he mentioned, I think, that point of significant risk to patient care. This was being given as the reason. But I'm not clear, I haven't heard what that is, why that wouldn't be the case with a HSE or other hospital that had a cooperation agreement. Because we told it was about the distance, but a publicly owned hospital built on that site would be a situation. We heard it was about doctors cooperating, but we've heard that they already cooperate between NMH and St Vincent's Hospital Group, and we heard it was about not wanting 2 systems of governance. So are we saying that there aren't 2 systems of governance and that St Vincent's Hospital Group is the only system of governance? I'm just not clear what the reason is, and I'm wondering, is it in fact that the price of cooperation is St Vincent's Hospital Group, rather than saying, I don't see why you can't cooperate with a public or other separate voluntary hospital, and I'm asking you, is it that you don't want to? Is it a price of cooperation that you would be involved in the governance of this new entity?
I'll have to move on then.
And that final question, thanks.
Okay. So there, in addition to the issue about patient care, patient risk, there are other practical issues about shared services, the construction of service corridors. There's a lot of technical issues on the way the camp is constructed.
But they're being dealt with St James and the National Children's Hospital.
St James's can probably comment for themselves. We're St Vincent's, and we were asked to enter a partnership agreement with the state, with Hollis Street, we had a set of guiding principles that we feel have now been complied with. We would we would have serious reservations if they were in any way disturbed. We think what's on the table that's been offered by us is fair and reasonable, and I think that you know, that's as much as I'd like to
Okay, so is that you don't want to, you wouldn't cooperate with a different model in that same way?
No, I think that's a fair summation. Yes, we wouldn't. And it was one of our guiding principles in terms of the board framework for making decisions about arriving at a solution, which I think is
and my point, I think, was lost
party.
earlier, just on the chairmanship. Just on the chairmanship, because I asked earlier, but it wasn't heard. In terms of as a landlord, do you think there might be an inappropriateness to being chairman of effectively, I know it's the HSE is the tenant, but of the hospital, which is you know, subject to these leasehold agreements?
Well, I think in the concept of a partnership concept, where you have three partners, it is fair and reasonable to have equal representation on the board and to have individual representatives of the three partners rotate the chairmanship from time to time. I think that's fair and reasonable and actually good governance. And also the point I would like to emphasise is that there are very important reserved powers in the constitution of the NMH at Park DAC. That hasn't been emphasised here today, but I would draw attention to it.
Okay.
Very
I'm
bespoke.
conscious of others.
And a golden share.
And we've discussed that,
yeah.
and I'm conscious others.
Sorry.
Alan Borg, Dan.
Thank you very much. Just, Mr. Minton, I think you did refer at one stage that the Sisters of Charity would have, or did petition the Vatican ahead of this process commencing. And clearly then there would have been a communication between the sisters, from the Vatican then back to the Sisters of Charity. Mm-hmm. Have you had sight of the correspondence?
No, we haven't. We haven't requested it because from our perspective, the negotiations between the Sisters of Charity and the Vatican are matters for the Sisters of Charity and the Vatican. What we're absolutely clear on is our negotiations with the sisters and around the transfer of shares has arrived in a set
absolutely,
of legal agreements.
I completely take your bona fides on that, but just from a public interest perspective, and this is a huge public interest issue for obvious reasons, would you think that it would be appropriate and certainly helpful if the Sisters of Charity were to publish the interaction with the Vatican?
Well, I think you'd...
And could you call on them to do so?
I think you'd have to ask them...
No, but I'm asking you, do you think it would be helpful, and would you call on them to do so? Like, clearly, if the information in it is benign, it would be very helpful.
Yeah. I think, frankly, it's unnecessary from the point of view of St. Vincent's Healthcare Group.
But you see, it goes to the core of the issue.
I think what is important here is to recognise that up to recently, St. Vincent's Healthcare Group was the shares were held by the Religious Sisters of Charity. Nobody in this room is unaware of the relationship between the Church and State in this country, in modern Ireland, has been. You could use a range of attitudes.
Yeah, well,
I won't offer them. And in that regard,
I have one other point I want to make.
And in that regard, Vincent's wants to be liberated from the relationship between Thursday.
Okay, I get it. It's not going to happen. I get it. So just in terms of the lease, and Deputy Shortall referred to this earlier on, and I just want to bring you back to it. Section 6.4, the landlord mortgage section. Your legal people are telling us that it's not possible to have a mortgage on a freehold. But yet 6.4 states that St. Vincent's Hospital Group commit, if you like, not to take a mortgage out without the prior consent of the tenant, which a reasonable period of time would be made available, and so on. Why is that in it if it's not a situation where the freehold can be mortgaged on? My good colleague Cullen Burke tells me that that is the case, but I want to know, why is that in the lease if it's not possible? Very simple answer. I need.
Sensitivity and discussion. There was just a sensitivity around it. It's the only reason it's there. It's still part of the ongoing.
Where did the sensitivity come from? Where did the sensitivity come from?
It's negotiation with HSE, the lease.
Because if you look at the schedule, it's fairly clear. I just think if it's not legally permissible, why is it in it?
I don't understand your last comment.
Well, if it's not legally possible to put a mortgage on a freehold, why is 6.4 in the lease?
So it is absolutely legally possible to put a mortgage on the freehold.
That's the question. So it is legally possible.
I've been saying that probably 3 or 4 times today.
And the building. Okay, Colin, go ahead.
Can I just clarify that issue in relation to 6.4? My understanding in relation to 6.4 is that the landlord can get a mortgage on the freehold interest in relation to the lands on which the buildings are built on. Okay, so, and I raised this earlier on, there are 2 different legal entities. There's a freehold interest and there's a leasehold interest. But the landlord cannot mortgage the leasehold interest. Am I correct in that?
Correct.
Okay, so what we have is a freehold interest which the landlord can mortgage, but that mortgage is subject to the consent of the lessee, the tenant, in this case, the HSE. Is that correct? And therefore, in other words, that if the property is mortgaged, that the freehold is mortgaged, that doesn't give the right to the bank or the financial institution to in any way interfere with the control of the building by the HSE or whoever they give a licence to in respect to that building.
Right. Yeah.
So in other words, let's be quite clear, because there seems to have been an impression given that the landlord can mortgage the entire building. No. Maybe you might clarify that.
No, I will. I'm sorry. This is probably my explanation. But so the landlord can, just ignoring 6.4 for a moment, the landlord can create security over the freehold interest. That security or a mortgage that it creates here takes subject to the lease, so the lease has a higher priority than security. So the security just catches the freehold, not the leasehold interest, where the entitlements to use and build and do everything are contained.
And if the bank or financial institution came along and decided to have full control over the freehold interest, in other words, the €10 per annum technically would be payable to the bank. If for some reason they forfeited on foot of the mortgage, would be payable to the bank rather than to St Vincent's.
Yes.
Right.
And likewise, in the event of there being a breach of the lease and the issue about the 800,000 being now the new rent, then that would be payable to the bank rather than to St Vincent's as such.
Correct. Yeah, the lender would, any lender would step into the landlord's shoes, effectively.
But there is no, but the bank or financial institution has no right to go next or near the building as long as that all of the terms and the conditions of the lease are being complied with by the HSE at all times.
Yep, and there we have a lot of law around how a tenant is protected.
Because you see, one of the problems that we now have, one of the problems that we have is that out in the public domain, and in particular it was put out by the person who was in here giving evidence last Thursday, that basically St Vincent's owned the building. This is what was said inside here. Is that correct?
So Vincent's will own the freehold of the property.
Not the building. They don't own the leasehold.
We will not own the building. Categorically, we will not own the building.
And therefore cannot mortgage it.
Correct. We can mortgage, just for the avoidance of any doubt, we can mortgage the freehold interest, which is worth a tenner a year. And in a former life, I can tell you, that wouldn't be worth the paperwork.
Last contribution, Annie Howie.
Sorry, I just want to confirm, when you mentioned when the sister charity sold or transferred the shares, yes, there was no money.
Disposed. Maybe the better word.
Sent off, or whatever way you want.
In layman's language, yes.
That there was no money transferred, but there was indemnity for the sister charity. Can you just explain what that indemnity involves? And then the second thing is just, St Vincent's Healthcare Group, are you guaranteeing that you will continue to offer the suite of services that you currently do offer on the site? So obviously, the whole reason for the moving over there is because it'll be a co-location, everything will be offered. So is there any guarantee therefore then that, you know, oncology won't be removed and things won't be at some point removed? Because then that would make this whole, you know, it would somewhat undermine the state's commitment to the move.
Well, I think the clinicians might want to give a more informed answer to services being curtailed, removed or added to, but certainly from a board perspective, we are an acute hospital for men and women. That point needs to be made. So I can't believe that other than developments in technology or other medical technological developments, but I've bow to superior.
Yeah, and then just about the indemnity as well.
We'll come
that's
back
all right,
to that presently.
I suppose in terms of it's a designated cancer centre, I can speak from the cancer point of view. We're increasing the number of medical oncologists, advanced nurse practitioners, looking for additional technology. We are a cancer hospital and we certainly wouldn't envisage the maternity care would take any precedence over the further development of cancer services.
There'll be absolutely no diminution of the spectrum of clinical services that are currently provided. If anything, this is going to enhance care delivery across both hospitals, not just clinically, but also in terms of academic research and medical education.
Just in relation to the deed of indemnity that was given pursuant to the share transfer agreement, this is in recognition, not unusual, in a charitable consideration-free transfer, that the St Vincent's Healthcare Group would indemnify the congregation with respect to claims in relation to the hospital sites, which is Michael's, the Vincent's Private and Vincent's Public Hospital. How those claims would be addressed, most of them, or would be in relation to insurance, the insurances that the group has in place, or many of the claims, the hospital has been trading for over 20 years in its own name as opposed to in the congregation's name, and so the risk would be considered minimal.
Okay, thanks very much. I think we've come to an end of the meeting. I'd like
clarification, just one thing. In the lease, that when you mentioned the services, are those services that you're saying in St Vincent's Hospital Group, are they guaranteed in the lease as the maternity hospital services are guaranteed in the lease?
No, I don't believe so. No. The lease is only for the national maternity. The lease is only for the national maternity hospital. It doesn't apply to, you know, the St.
Okay, so there isn't a guarantee in a legal sense of those
Mary,
services.
you're really
apologies. Apologies, Chair. Yeah.
I thought we were finished, but go on if you want.
Could I just ask, is there any chance we could get the maps to go with the documents? Because we weren't supplied with those.
Okay, well,
would you send them to us overnight, please?
Absolutely.
Great, thank you.
Again, I really appreciate the time and effort you put in today's meeting. You know,
very useful meeting, I must say. Thank you.
I think it was really